The stagecoach ride from Abilene to Red Mesa took 3 days and left Hannah Whitmore with a bruised tailbone, dust in her teeth, and a low-grade headache that had settled behind her left eye sometime around the second afternoon and refused to leave. She'd shared the coach with a traveling salesman who smelled of bay rum and talked too much about hat prices, a young mother with an infant who cried in rotating shifts, and an elderly man who slept through everything, including a wheel getting stuck in a creek crossing near the Kansas border. Hannah had sat with her bag on her lap and her eyes on the window, watching the land flatten and spread and go brown in ways she hadn't expected. She'd grown up in Pennsylvania, where even the poorest plots had trees and creek banks, and the sense that the earth was doing something. Out here, the earth seemed to have given up on spectacle. It just went. Grass and sky and more grass and the occasional smear of rock formation on the horizon. Beautiful in a way she didn't quite have words for yet, but unnerving too. There was nowhere to hide out here. Everything was visible. She'd read Emmett Grady's letters so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. 12 letters over 8 months. He wrote in a careful, deliberate hand, the kind of penmanship that suggested a man who took his time with things, who didn't rush toward conclusions. He described his ranch in southeastern Colorado Territory with the plain directness of someone who had no talent for boasting, but every reason to. 400 acres, good water from a spring-fed creek. A small herd that he was building up year by year. A house that needed a woman's eye, he'd said, which Hannah had read charitably. She'd learned to read things charitably. It was how you survived a lifetime of people saying what they meant about you too openly. He'd never said much about himself that was personal. She'd noticed that. But she hadn't pushed. She had her own things she kept folded up tight. What she knew, Emmett Grady was 41 years old, a widower, and practical enough to understand that ranching alone was a slower kind of dying. He needed a partner. She needed a future. The mathematics of it were simple, and she'd made her peace with simple. The stagecoach pulled into Red Mesa just past 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday in late April. The town was smaller than she'd imagined. One main street with maybe 15 or 16 buildings, a few side roads that petered out into scrubland, a livery stable, a general store with a porch that needed work, a saloon, a hotel that looked like it had been built by someone who'd run out of money before they got to the roof. Hannah was the last one off the coach. She always was. The door was narrow and she'd learned years ago to wait rather than squeeze through while people watched. She came down the steps carefully, her bag in one hand and her skirt in the other, and when her feet hit the ground, she straightened and looked around. There was no one waiting for her. She'd expected that. Emmett hadn't known her exact arrival day. She'd had to reroute through Abilene when the Northern Line had delays. She checked her bag for the letter with his address and walked toward the general store, where a woman in an apron was sweeping the porch. "Excuse me," Hannah said. "I'm looking for the Grady Ranch, Emmett Grady. Could you point me in the right direction?" The woman stopped sweeping. She looked at Hannah the way people had been looking at Hannah her entire life. That quick, assessing scan that started at the face and moved down and came to some conclusion before a word had been exchanged. Hannah was used to it. She kept her expression neutral and waited. "You're not from here," the woman said. "No, ma'am. I've just arrived. I'm Hannah Whitmore. I'm engaged to Mr. Grady." Something shifted in the woman's face. Not unkindness exactly, more like discomfort, the kind a person gets when they're holding information they'd rather not deliver. "You'd better come inside," the woman said. Her name was Dora Finch, and she ran the general store with her husband, who was out back with a broken wagon axle and couldn't be pulled away. She sat Hannah down on a stool near the counter and poured her a cup of coffee that was mostly grounds and handed it over with the expression of someone bracing for an unpleasant task. "There's no easy way to tell you this," Dora said. "Emmett Grady passed on 3 weeks ago. Heart gave out while he was mending fence line on the north pasture. 2 of his men found him that evening." Hannah held the coffee cup in both hands and looked at the surface of it. 3 weeks ago, while she'd been packing her trunk in Philadelphia, while she'd been writing a letter to her sister that she never sent, while she'd been sitting in a train car outside of Cincinnati, watching rain streak the window and thinking about what it would feel like to belong somewhere. "I see," she said. "I'm sorry," Dora said. Had you been corresponding long?" 8 months. "I'm sorry," Dora said again. There was genuine sympathy in it. Hannah appreciated that. She didn't always get genuine. She sat in that store for a while longer than she should have. Dora didn't rush her out. The coffee was terrible, and Hannah drank it slowly and thought about her options, which were limited in the specific way that options become limited when you've spent the last of your savings on a stagecoach ticket, and your return to Pennsylvania would mean going back to a house where you were not welcome. Her father had made that clear before she left. Don't come back without a husband or without money. There's no room here for something that doesn't pull its weight. He hadn't said it cruelly, or hadn't meant to. He said everything in the same flat tone, but the meaning had come through fine. She wasn't going back. The problem with Red Mesa was that it was small enough for everyone to know your business by sundown. By the time Hannah had finished her coffee and stepped back out into the street, she had the distinct sense that word had already moved. A man near the livery watched her with frank curiosity. Two women on the far side of the street stopped their conversation and didn't quite restart it until she'd walked past. She found the hotel and paid for 2 nights with money she couldn't really afford, and sat on the edge of the bed in a room that smelled of old wood and something floral that had long since given up its fight, and thought about what came next. She was 26 years old. She was in a territory she didn't know, in a town full of strangers with no prospects and limited funds. She had a trunk of practical clothes, a decent head for numbers, and a stubbornness that her mother had called her worst quality, and her father had occasionally called her only useful one. She also had bruises she couldn't explain to strangers without explaining a great deal more. The faded yellow mark along her left forearm, where her uncle's hand had landed during her last night in Philadelphia. The tenderness along her ribs that was nearly healed now. These things she kept covered. You learned to keep them covered. She didn't cry that first night. She thought she might, but instead she made a list in the small journal she carried. What I have, what I need, what I can do. The list of what she could do was longer than she expected when she actually wrote it down, and she fell asleep holding the journal on her chest, which was not comfortable but felt oddly like an anchor. She met Cole Brennan on her second day, and the meeting was not auspicious. She'd gone to the Grady Ranch. She'd felt she had to. There might be something there about the estate, some information about whether anyone was managing things, whether there was an arrangement she could possibly slot herself into. She knew it was a long shot. She went anyway because standing still felt worse than moving in the wrong direction. The ranch was about 2 miles east of town along a road that hadn't decided whether to be a road or just a series of wagon ruts. She walked it. She hadn't wanted to spend money on a hired horse, and besides, the morning was cool and clear, and the walking helped her think. The Grady property was visible from a distance. A modest house, white paint going gray, a barn that was better maintained than the house, a series of corrals where a few horses moved in slow circles. Closer up, she could see that the fence along the front needed work, and the porch boards had a soft look that suggested rot. There was a man at the corral, tall, dark-haired, doing something to a fence post with a piece of wire and what looked like considerable irritation. He was maybe 35, lean in the way men who work outdoors get lean, not thin but reduced to what was useful. He had his hat pushed back and a smear of grease or dirt along one cheekbone. He saw her coming and straightened up. "This is private property," he said. Not aggressive, exactly. More like someone who'd had to say this before and found it tedious. "I know," Hannah said. "I was engaged to Mr. Grady. I've only just arrived, and I was told of his passing yesterday. I'm sorry to intrude. I thought perhaps I should see the property. It's foolish. I don't know what I expected." He looked at her the way most people looked at her. That same scan, that same flicker of assessment. She held his gaze because she'd decided somewhere around mile 1 of the walk that she was done looking at the ground. "You're the woman from Pennsylvania," he said. "I am, Hannah Whitmore." He wiped his hand on his pants and extended it, which she appreciated. "Cole Brennan. I've been running my family's ranch about 3 miles north. Emmett and I shared a fence line and a fair amount of fence mending over the years. I was sorry to lose him." "Did you know him well?" "Well enough." He seemed to consider whether to say more. He was a decent man, quiet, kept his word. His letters suggested the same. Something in Cole's expression shifted slightly. Acknowledgement, maybe, that this was a strange situation and she was handling it with more composure than he'd perhaps expected. He glanced toward the house. "You want to see inside?" "I don't want to impose." You're not imposing. I've got a key. Emmett asked me to keep an eye on things until his brother comes from Missouri. Come on. The house was small and spare and immaculate in the way of a man who lived alone and had no one to be untidy for. There was a table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, a narrow bed in the single bedroom. On the table, a coffee tin that turned out to hold nothing but dried beans. On the windowsill, a photograph of a woman Hannah didn't recognize, the late wife, she guessed, by the age of the photograph. His brother's coming? Hannah said. That's the plan, though I've had no word of when exactly. Cole was leaning in the doorway, giving her room. The man doesn't write, from what I understand. What happens to the property in the meantime? That's a question for the lawyer in town. Fellow named Aldridge. Handles most of the legal matters out here. Hannah stood in the middle of the small room and looked at the 2 chairs at the table and thought about the letters she'd memorized and about the strange intimacy of knowing someone only through their written words, knowing the shape of their thinking, but nothing of the sound of their voice. Emmett Grady had taken 8 months to write her into his plans, and then died before those plans could begin. She felt grief for him that surprised her with its specificity. Not the grief of lost love, she'd known him too little for that, but the grief of a life cut short before she could know whether it would have worked. That felt unfair in a particular way. I appreciate you showing me, she said. I'll let you get back to your work. She turned to go. Miss Whitmore, Cole said. She stopped. I don't know what your situation is. That's your business. But if you're in a difficult spot and need time to sort things out, my ranch has a spare room. It's not much. My foreman used to use it, and it still smells like boot leather, but it's clean and it's got a door that locks, and you'd be welcome to it while you figure out what comes next. Hannah looked at him. In her experience, offers of help came with footnotes. They came with expectations attached, with conditions written in small print, with a debt that would be called in at a moment of someone else's choosing. She was 30 seconds of instinct and 26 years of history away from saying no. Why? She said. Cole didn't look offended by the directness. He thought about it the way he seemed to think about most things, practically, without drama. Because you walked 2 miles out here and you're not crying, he said. And because Emmett would have wanted someone looking out for you. It was such a plain answer that she almost laughed. Thank you, she said. I'll think on it. She thought on it for about 4 hours, until her hotel money ran its mental calculation again and came up short, and then she went to find Cole Brennan and tell him she would take the room. The Brennan Ranch was not grand. It was something better than that. It was functional, visibly maintained, and gave the impression of a place that had been built by someone who cared whether it lasted. The house was larger than Emmett's, 2 stories with a covered porch, painted a dark red that had weathered to something closer to brown. There was a bunkhouse set back from the main house where the 2 hired hands lived, a root cellar, a chicken coop that seemed to be involved in some ongoing dispute with its fence. Cole's housekeeper, a stout woman in her 60s named Vera, looked at Hannah with the particular directness of someone who has seen enough of life to have no patience for pretense. You'll need to learn the cook schedule, Vera said, by way of greeting. Breakfast at 5:30, supper at 6. I don't do lunch. There's bread. I can help with cooking, Hannah said. Can you? I can follow instructions. Vera's expression suggested this was an acceptable answer. We'll see, she said, which was not warm but was not unwelcoming either, and Hannah had spent her whole life reading the difference. The spare room was exactly as Cole had described, small, smelling of old leather and something faintly metallic, with a narrow window that looked out over the corral. The bed had a wool blanket that was clean but not soft. There was a hook on the back of the door and a small table with a basin and a pitcher. Hannah unpacked her trunk methodically. She hung her 2 good dresses on the hook, tucked her journals and her supply of ink under the mattress for safekeeping, and set her small box of medicines. She traveled with willow bark, mustard powder, a tin of salve her mother's sister had taught her to make, on the windowsill. She sat on the bed and put her hands in her lap and listened to the sounds of the ranch. Horses. A man's voice calling something she couldn't make out. The wind doing what wind in this country seemed to do constantly, which was everything. All right, she thought, all right, here's where you are. This is the situation. Now figure it out. She was good at that conversation. She'd been having it since she was 11 years old. The first few days were awkward in the way that any situation involving strangers in close proximity tends to be awkward. Cole was at work before she woke and often didn't come in until supper. His hired hands, a young man named Pete, and a quiet older one called Ruiz, regarded her with curious respect. They'd clearly been told to be decent to her, and they were trying hard, which was touching in its way. Vera warmed to her slightly when Hannah turned out to be a capable hand in the kitchen. Not a brilliant one. Hannah had no illusions. But she knew the basics, and she didn't need to be told things twice, and she cleaned up after herself without being asked, which Vera seemed to consider a foundational virtue. "You've worked in a kitchen before," Vera said on the second day. It wasn't a question. "I ran my family's household from the time I was 14, Hannah said. My mother was ill for several years." Vera was making pie crust with the efficiency of someone who had stopped thinking about the steps and just did them. "And your father?" "He remarried when I was 18. My stepmother had her own ways of running things." She kept her voice even. It seemed like the right time to figure out something else. Vera didn't ask anything else, which Hannah appreciated. She'd found that people who didn't ask questions either didn't care or understood that some answers had too many parts. On her 5th day at the ranch, Hannah asked Cole if she could look at his ledgers. They were at the supper table. Pete and Ruiz had finished and gone. Vera was washing dishes with the door between the kitchen and the main room, pushed mostly closed but not all the way, because Vera didn't believe in closed doors when there were things to hear. Cole looked up from his coffee. "My ledgers," he said. "I'm good with numbers," Hannah said. "Better than average, and I'd rather be useful than sit in that room. If there's something wrong with the idea, tell me and I won't ask again." Cole was quiet for a moment. She'd noticed that he had a way of pausing before he said things that might matter. Not a theatrical pause, not the pause of a man building to something, but the pause of someone making sure they meant what they were about to say. "Nothing wrong with the idea," he said. "I'll be honest with you. I hate the ledgers. My foreman used to do them, and then he moved on, and I've been doing them myself for 6 months, and there's something wrong somewhere, but I can't find it. I can probably find it." "I believe you." He brought them to her after supper. 2 thick ledgers, handwritten in 2 different hands, the foreman's neat entries and then Cole's larger, looser ones. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close and opened the first one. It took her 40 minutes to find the error, a column transposition from 8 months ago that had been compounded by a wrong assumption about winter feed costs. Not disastrous, but not nothing. She brought the ledgers to Cole in the parlor where he was reading something, or sitting with something open that he might have been reading, she wasn't sure, and set them on the table beside him and pointed to the relevant pages. "Here," she said, "and here." These 2 numbers were switched, and then everything after was built on the wrong total. Cole looked at the pages, looked at her. "8 months?" he said. "Yes." "I've been staring at those pages for 8 months. You knew what you were looking for. That's the problem. When you already know what the numbers should say, you see what you expect." He made a sound that might have been a short laugh. "How long did it take you?" 40 minutes, roughly." "Right." He leaned back. "All right, Miss Whitmore. You're looking at my ledgers." "Hannah," she said, "if I'm going to be reading your private finances, you should probably call me Hannah." "All right," he said. "Hannah." Ket. The town of Red Mesa had, like all small towns, a social economy that operated in ways both formal and invisible. There was the explicit version, who was on good terms with whom, who'd had a dispute about water rights 2 years ago, who owed who a favor. And then there was the undertow of it, the unspoken sorting that happened in the way eyes moved when you walked into a room. Hannah walked into the general store on her 8th day in Red Mesa to get supplies and felt the undertow immediately. Dora Finch was cordial to her. A few others nodded. But there was a group of women near the fabric bolts who stopped their conversation when she came in and started it again in a lower register, and Hannah didn't need to hear the words to understand the shape of what was being said. She'd been the subject of that particular kind of conversation her entire life. She came all this way and the man died. Now she's living out at the Brennan place. Imagine. What does Cole Brennan want with her? She can't possibly be working. A woman her size wouldn't last a week with real ranch work. Cole's always been too soft-hearted. That's the trouble. She bought flour and salt and a spool of thread and walked out with her chin level and her hand steady and made it all the way to the edge of town before she stopped and sat on a fence rail for a moment and breathed. It was the her-size part that always landed with its particular weight. She'd been carrying extra weight since she was 14. The shape had come with the hard years, with the years of standing in for her mother and managing an unhappy household and eating when she could and badly when she did. Her body had recorded the history of her life in a way she hadn't chosen and couldn't entirely change, and people had been reading that recording and drawing conclusions from it her entire adult life. She was lazy, she was weak, she was undisciplined, she was unhealthy. She couldn't ride a horse, couldn't do real work, couldn't endure hardship, couldn't be beautiful, couldn't be desirable. All of this concluded from a glance. She knew the truth, which was more complicated and less interesting than the story they'd written. But truth rarely wins against a story people have already decided to believe. She sat on the fence rail for another minute, and then she got up and started walking back toward the ranch. Enough of that. She had ledgers to finish and a kitchen to help with, and if she could manage it, a conversation with Pete about how the livestock tallying worked because she wanted to understand the full picture of the operation, not just the numbers. You couldn't understand numbers without understanding what they represented. She had things to learn. She'd better start learning them. Tupfum? Pete turned out to be unexpectedly willing to teach. He was 22, earnest, and had the kind of enthusiasm for his work that people get when they're doing something they're genuinely suited for. He'd been with cattle since he was 15, and he talked about them the way other people talk about complicated relatives, with frustrated affection, deep familiarity, and the occasional exasperated sigh. The main thing about livestock records, he told her, leaning against the corral fence on her second week, is you've got to check twice because they don't hold still. By the time you've counted the back 40, 3 of them have moved. How do you get an accurate count? You don't, entirely. You do your best. You know your herd well enough that when something's off, you feel it before you see it. That's not very satisfying from a record-keeping standpoint. Pete laughed. He had a gap between his 2 front teeth that made him look younger than he was. No, I guess not. But you get used to approximate. Out here, approximate is mostly what you get. Ruiz was harder to read. He'd been with Cole for 7 years, which Hannah gathered was significant. That was the kind of loyalty you earned, not inherited. He was a man in his late 40s who said very little and noticed a great deal, and Hannah suspected that her position at the ranch was contingent in some unspoken way on his approval. He watched her for 2 weeks before he said more than 6 words to her at one time, and what he said when he finally spoke was, "You know what you're about." Hannah was mending a harness strap at the time because she'd watched how it was done, and then asked if she could try, and Ruiz had said nothing and handed her the materials. She looked up. "I'm learning," she said. "That's not the same thing." He took the harness strap from her, examined her work, handed it back. "It's good. You kept the tension right." She hadn't known what the right tension was when she started. She'd figured it out by the 3rd attempt and hadn't said anything about the first 2. "Thank you," she said. Ruiz went back to what he was doing. Hannah went back to the harness strap and felt something small and warm settle in her chest. Wow. She'd been at the ranch for 3 weeks when the first letter arrived. It came addressed to Miss Hannah Whitmore, care of the Red Mesa post office, and Dora Finch held it at arm's length when she handed it over as if uncertain what it might do. Hannah recognized the handwriting immediately. She waited until she was alone in her room to open it. She sat on the bed with the window light falling across the page and read it twice before she set it down. "My dear Miss Whitmore, I have learned of your arrival in Red Mesa and of your unfortunate circumstances. I am deeply concerned for your welfare and urge you to reconsider your position. A woman without resources or protection in frontier territory is in a precarious situation that you are perhaps not fully equipped to navigate. I have always had a high regard for your qualities and would very much like to discuss a possible arrangement that might be mutually beneficial to us both. I will be traveling west in the coming weeks and hope we might meet. Your servant in friendship, Victor Hale." Hannah folded the letter very carefully along its original creases and put it in the small box under her mattress where she kept things she needed to remember but didn't want to look at. Victor Hale. She sat very still for a long moment. She had thought, she had allowed herself to believe because the alternative was too exhausting to hold on to. that Victor Hale was a chapter she'd closed, that the distance of 1,000 miles was sufficient, that a man of his comfortable Eastern life would not bother to follow a woman he'd never been able to legally claim across the continent. I have always had a high regard for your qualities. Victor Hale had no regard for her qualities. Victor Hale had a regard for what he considered his property, and in the taxonomy of his thinking, Hannah Whitmore had been his property since her father had shaken his hand over a dinner table in Philadelphia 2 years ago and agreed to an arrangement that no one had asked Hannah about. Her father had been in debt. Victor had offered to settle the debt. The price was Hannah. Her father had dressed it up in nicer words. A good match, a solid man, a comfortable future, you'd be provided for. But the mathematics of it had been clear enough. She'd run before the wedding. She'd spent 14 months finding ways to stay gone, moving from one cousin's house to another, taking in sewing, working as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant who paid her in cash and didn't ask questions. And then Emmett Grady's advertisement in a women's journal, Widower 41, seeks capable woman for partnership in Frontier Homestead. Character more important than youth or circumstance. And the careful, deliberate letters, and the plan, and the stagecoach ticket, and the hope that distance was the same thing as freedom. Apparently it was not. She pulled the letter back out and read it one more time. I will be traveling west in the coming weeks. She needed to think. More specifically, she needed to think without letting the fear do her thinking for her, because fear made bad decisions, and she couldn't afford bad decisions right now. She put the letter away again and went to help Vera with supper. Nyam. She didn't tell Cole about the letter that night, or the next day. She turned the situation over in her mind the way you work a stone in your hand, feeling for the edges of it, trying to understand its full shape before you decided what to do with it. What were her options? She could say nothing and hope Victor's letter was a gesture and not a genuine plan. She had lived with Victor Hale's gestures for 2 years. They were never just gestures. She could leave Red Mesa and go, somewhere. She had enough money now, with 3 weeks of small earnings from Cole's bookkeeping, to get a bus ticket to another town. She could start again. Or she could stay. She hadn't run from Philadelphia intending to run forever. She'd run because she'd had no other option. But she was in a different position now, or close to one. She had a place that, tentative as it was, felt like the beginning of something. She had work she was good at. She had people who, if they weren't exactly hers yet, were becoming familiar in the way that matters. She had walked 2 miles to see a dead man's house and come back with a job and something like a future. She was not going to walk away from that without a fight. She decided she would tell Cole. Not yet. She needed a few more days to understand the shape of the threat. But soon. She was chopping carrots for Vera when she made that decision, and the knife came down a little harder than necessary, and Vera looked over with one eyebrow raised and said nothing, which Hannah appreciated. Gee. What she didn't expect was how quickly the ranch became something she understood. 3 weeks in, she knew the names of every horse. She knew which sections of fence ran loose and which held solid. She knew that Pete had a habit of underestimating feed requirements because he calculated for good weather and should always be corrected upward by 15%. She knew that Ruiz could tell which cattle were ailing 2 days before any visible sign appeared, and that this knowledge was worth more than any written record. She started keeping a parallel set of notes, not the official ledger, which she updated weekly with Cole, but her own observations. Patterns. Things that happened and then happened again. The way a certain wind direction brought weather within 24 hours. The feed consumption patterns over a cold snap. Small things, but things that added up. Cole noticed. "You're taking notes on the weather," he said one evening, not accusingly, just noting it. "I'm taking notes on a lot of things," Hannah said. "It helps me understand the whole picture." "And what does the whole picture look like?" She considered. "The ranch is solid. You're not overextended, and you've made smart decisions about what to keep and what to cut. The cattle are in better condition than I expected for this time of year, which I think is Ruiz's doing. The main vulnerability is the north fence line. Pete told me there are sections that need work before the next hard rain, and I think he's been trying to mention it and not getting traction." Cole was quiet for a moment. "He told me about the north fence line," he said. "I know. In his words, he told you twice, and you said you'd get to it." I've been busy. I know, that's not a criticism. It's a priority question. She met his eyes. How much would it cost to fix the fence versus how much would it cost if cattle got through onto Aldridge's land? Cole looked at the table, looked at her. You've thought about this a lot, he said. I've had time to think, Hannah said, and I'm better when I'm thinking about something specific. So am I, he said. He leaned back in his chair. I'll send Pete and Ruiz to the north fence this week. Good, Hannah said. There was a moment of quiet that wasn't uncomfortable. Outside, the wind moved through the grass in its constant, restless way. A horse knocked against the corral fence once, and then went still. You're nothing like I expected, Cole said. He didn't say it with any particular inflection. Not as a compliment, not as a complaint, just as an observation. Hannah thought about asking what he'd expected. She decided against it. She already knew the shape of the answer. I know, she said instead. She closed her notebook and said goodnight and went to her room. And when she sat on the bed in the dark, she let herself feel the day fully for a minute. The small victories of it, the north fence conversation, Ruiz's nod when she'd correctly predicted the morning weather, the way Pete had started explaining things to her with the tone of someone who expected her to understand. It wasn't much, but it was real. She was still, underneath everything else, afraid of the letter in the box under her mattress. She was still, underneath everything else, aware that Victor Hale moved through the world with money and influence and the absolute conviction that he was owed things. But she was also still here, 2 miles from a dead man's house and 3 weeks into something she hadn't planned and couldn't fully name yet. She'd been afraid before. She'd kept moving anyway. She blew out the lamp and listened to the wind and the horses and the creak of the house settling, and eventually she slept. The north fence got fixed on a Tuesday. Hannah knew because she heard Pete and Ruiz leave before sunrise, the horses moving out at a steady walk into the gray pre-dawn, and she lay in her narrow bed and listened until the sound faded and there was only wind and the occasional complaint from the chicken coop. She hadn't slept well. She hadn't slept well for most of the week, which she attributed partly to the letter still sitting in the box under her mattress, and partly to the fact that her body had not yet fully adjusted to a schedule that began before it felt morning had earned its name. She got up and helped Vera with breakfast and said nothing about sleeping poorly, because Vera was not the kind of woman who wanted to hear about other people's nights. Cole came in from checking on the horses and poured himself coffee and sat down and said, "They'll be back by noon if the wire holds." "It'll hold," Hannah said. "Pete knows what he's doing." "He does." Cole wrapped both hands around his cup. He looked tired too, she noticed. The specific tired of someone who'd been carrying things longer than was comfortable. He just needs someone to tell him it's worth doing. Don't most people? Cole looked at her over the rim of his cup. "Yeah," he said. "I suppose they do." Vera set a plate of biscuits between them and retreated to the kitchen with the pointed neutrality of someone who was listening to everything and commenting on nothing. Hannah had come to appreciate Vera's pointed neutrality. It was a form of privacy, oddly enough. She'd been at the ranch a month now. 4 weeks of waking before dawn and going to bed with her hands tired and her mind still running numbers and observations and the occasional low-grade fear about Victor Hale. 4 weeks of learning what she could learn and building what she could build and trying not to think too far ahead, because thinking too far ahead in her experience tended to produce anxiety more reliably than plans. But she was going to have to tell Cole about Victor. She'd known it for 10 days. She kept finding reasons to put it off. The timing was wrong. She needed to know more. She didn't want to watch him recalibrate his opinion of her as someone who'd brought trouble with her like luggage. The truth was, she was afraid of what his face would do when she told him. She'd gotten used to the way he looked at her now, which was with a kind of straightforward respect she hadn't encountered often enough to take for granted. After breakfast, she sat at the kitchen table with the ledgers and tried to concentrate, and managed about 45 minutes of genuine focus before she gave up and went looking for something physical to do. She found it in the chicken coop, which was in a state of organizational chaos that Vera had been managing through sheer force of habit rather than any underlying logic. Hannah spent an hour sorting the situation out, replacing the nesting material, repairing the latch on the feed box that had been hanging loose for what looked like weeks, sweeping out the accumulated winter's worth of debris that had drifted into the corners. It was not dignified work. It was necessary work, and necessary work had the virtue of leaving no room for the other noise. She was coming out of the coop with a bucket of old straw when she heard the rider. The horse came in from the south road at a canter, slowing as it reached the yard, and the man on it was someone she didn't recognize, well dressed for the territory, which meant his coat was clean and his boots weren't held together with wire. He had a neat dark beard and a way of sitting the horse that suggested he was used to people watching him arrive. Cole came around from the barn. "Mr. Brennan," the man said. "James Aldridge. I believe we've met." "We have," Cole said. His voice had changed slightly. Not unfriendly, but more careful than his usual register. "What can I do for you?" "I'm actually here about a legal matter." Aldridge glanced toward Hannah, who had stopped near the fence with her bucket and was making no effort to look like she wasn't paying attention. "Regarding the Grady estate, I understand you've been something of a caretaker since Emmett's passing. I wanted to discuss the status of the property and certain claims that have come to my attention." "Claims," Cole said. "Perhaps we could speak inside." Hannah set her bucket down and walked toward the house. She had no legal standing in this conversation and every reason to listen to as much of it as possible. She went to the kitchen and told Vera she was going to sweep the parlor, which was not something she'd ever done before, and which Vera regarded with frank suspicion, but Vera handed her the broom without comment. She could hear the conversation from the parlor. She didn't catch everything, but she caught enough. Someone, Aldridge didn't name them directly, said only a party with an interest, had contacted him about the Grady property. This party had apparently expressed interest in purchasing the land at a price Aldridge described as fair, which in Hannah's experience meant below value. The timing was convenient. Emmett's brother had written to say he was unwell and could not travel west for some months, and the estate was in a legal limbo that a motivated buyer might be able to exploit. Cole asked questions. Clean, direct questions. Who was this party? What was their connection to the territory? Had they approached Emmett before his death? Aldridge was smooth in the way of men trained to be smooth. He answered without quite answering, filled the silence with legal phrasing, and left after about 20 minutes with a promise to be in touch. Hannah put the broom away when she heard the horse leave the yard. Cole came into the kitchen. He stood with his hands on the back of a chair and looked at the table and didn't say anything for a moment. "Someone's trying to buy the Grady place cheap," he said, finally. "I heard." He looked up. Not surprised, exactly. "The parlor door doesn't close all the way," he said. "I know. I fixed the latch on the chicken coop. I can probably fix the parlor door, too." Something moved through his expression. Amusement, quickly folded back. "Do you know anything about this?" Hannah sat down at the table. She'd been putting this conversation off for 10 days, and there was no putting it off anymore. "I might," she said. "There's something I should have told you before now. I'm sorry I didn't." She told him about Victor Hale. She told it plainly, without decoration, the way she'd practiced telling it in her head. The facts in order, without the emotional weight she'd been carrying that would have made the story unwieldy. Her father's debt, Victor's offer, the arrangement she hadn't been consulted on, the months of trying to comply, the moment she'd understood that compliance wasn't going to protect her, the 14 months of moving until she'd found Emmett's advertisement and built herself an exit. She told him about the bruises she hadn't mentioned before. She kept her voice level. She watched Cole's hands on the back of the chair go still. "He followed you here," Cole said. "That letter was a warning shot. He wanted me to know he was coming before he arrived so I'd have time to be afraid." She looked at her own hands on the table. "He's very good at that, giving people time to be afraid." "And you think he's the one trying to buy the Grady property?" "I don't know that for certain. But Victor Hale is a man who operates by controlling the options available to other people. If he could acquire land adjacent to where I'm living, it would give him standing in the territory. It would give him a reason to be here that looks legitimate." Cole was quiet for a long moment. The afternoon light was moving across the kitchen floor in the way it did at this hour, that long golden stretch that made everything look more peaceful than it was. "Why didn't you tell me when you got the letter?" he said. Not accusatory. Genuinely asking. Hannah considered the honest answer. "Because I didn't want to be a problem you had to solve," she said. "I came here with nothing, and you gave me a room and work, and I didn't want to find out that the cost of that was this." "The cost of it," Cole said. He said it flatly, like he was tasting the phrase and finding it wrong-shaped. "I know that sounds It sounds like you're used to people helping you only until it costs them something, Cole said, and then leaving. Hannah looked at him. He pulled out the chair and sat down across from her. I'm not going to pretend I know what to do about Victor Hale, he said, but I'm not asking you to leave, if that's what you're waiting for me to say. She hadn't known she was waiting for that until he said it. She felt something in her chest release in a way that was almost painful. She kept her expression controlled because she'd learned that letting relief show too quickly made it easy for people to take back what they'd just offered. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet. If this man's got money and lawyers, this is going to get complicated. I know. I'm going to talk to the sheriff. He might not be able to do anything. Victor hasn't done anything illegal. Not here, not yet. Maybe not. But I want Walt to know the situation. Cole stood. And I want you to write down everything you know about Victor Hale. Every piece of documentation you have from your time in Philadelphia, every letter, every name of anyone who might have seen something. Can you do that? Hannah thought about the box under her mattress. The letter, yes. And the other she'd saved. The one from her cousin who'd sheltered her the first 3 months, who'd written with careful language about the man who'd come asking questions. The one from the dry goods merchant who'd employed her, who'd been visited by a lawyer named Hessler and had written to warn her. I can do that, she said. Good. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. I'm going to go check on Pete and Ruiz. He went out. Hannah sat at the table for a minute longer, listening to the sound of his boots on the porch steps. Then she went to her room and pulled the box from under the mattress and started sorting through what she had. She'd been afraid of the town's opinion since her first day in it, but she'd been underestimating how much of the town had already made up its mind. She understood this more clearly when she went to the general store on a Wednesday morning and arrived at the same time as Margaret Holt, who ran the dressmaker's shop across the street and who had the particular social confidence of a woman who'd been the arbiter of local taste for long enough that she'd forgotten it was a role she'd been given and not a natural right. Margaret Holt looked at Hannah the way certain women had been looking at Hannah since she was adolescent, with the specific, considered gaze of someone taking measurements and finding them wanting. Miss Whitmore, she said. Her voice was cordial in the surface layer. Underneath, assessment, conclusion, dismissal. I hear you've been quite useful out at the Brennan place. I've been trying to contribute, Hannah said. Cole Brennan is a kind man, Margaret said, with the inflection of someone completing a sentence that began with to. Hannah selected a spool of thread from the rack. He is, she agreed. He's always been soft-hearted about strays, I suppose one might say. People who come through in difficult circumstances. He housed that boy Pete for a month before he could pay him. Did you know that? And Ruiz, well, a small smile, the kind that doesn't involve the eyes. Cole tends to collect people. It's admirable in its way. Hannah looked at her directly. What way would that be? Margaret blinked. She hadn't expected that. I only mean, she said, that you're in an unusual situation. A woman alone at a ranch, without family in the territory. People talk. Not cruelly, she added, with the practiced ease of someone who had said many cruel things while prefacing them this way. But they notice. They noticed me when I walked in from the stagecoach, Hannah said. I've been being noticed since I got off that coach. I've noticed them back. She set the thread on the counter and met Margaret Holt's eyes. I appreciate the warning, Mrs. Holt. I'll be careful. She paid for her items and left before Margaret could redirect the conversation, and she walked back to the ranch without letting any of it show on her face, which she'd gotten very good at. The part that stung wasn't the implied insult. She'd absorbed implied insults her whole life like they were weather. Unpleasant, but not surprising. The part that stung was that Margaret Holt wasn't entirely wrong. Hannah was a stray, by the technical definition. She'd arrived without belonging anywhere and had attached herself to a situation out of necessity. The fact that she was making herself useful didn't change the structure of the thing. She thought about this while she walked, and by the time she reached the ranch, she'd come to the same conclusion she always came to, which was that the structure was what it was, and the only variable she controlled was what she did inside of it. You couldn't change where you'd started. You could change where you ended up. She went inside and asked Vera to show her how to make the spiced apple preserves that appeared at every meal in small glass jars. Because the supply was running low, and Vera had mentioned twice that the process was laborious, which was as close as Vera got to asking for help. She learned to ride during the 5th week. This had not been her idea exactly. Pete had been the one to suggest it, with the cautious diplomacy of someone who'd been working up to something for days. "The thing is," he said one morning, "there are parts of the property it'd be useful for you to be able to see firsthand. For the records, the south pasture, the creek section. I can describe them to you, but it's not the same as seeing." "I know," Hannah said. "And you don't ride." "No. I could teach you." He said it quickly, like he'd been holding it in. "If you wanted, it doesn't have to be. It's just practical. For the work." Hannah looked at Pete, who was trying very hard to look like this was a purely logistical proposal. She appreciated the effort. "All right," she said. The first session lasted 40 minutes and left her with a bruised inner thigh and a profound respect for how much she didn't know. The horse Cole assigned her was a gray mare named Patience, which turned out to be either optimistic or ironic, depending on who you asked. Patience was calm, but not indifferent. She made her opinions known in small ways. The slight shift of weight, the turn of an ear, and Hannah found herself reading these communications with the same attention she gave the ledgers, trying to understand the logic underneath. She fell off twice. The first time cleanly, landing on her side in the dirt and lying there for a moment taking stock of what hurt. Pete was beside her immediately, and she could see in his face the mix of alarm and the desperate effort not to make a face. "I'm all right," she said. She was mostly right. Her hip would be unhappy with her by evening. "You don't have to—" "Help me up." He helped her up. She got back on the horse. Patience turned her head and regarded Hannah with one large liquid eye that conveyed approximately nothing. "All right," Hannah said to the horse, "let's try this again." By the end of the 2nd week, she could manage a slow canter without gripping the saddle horn like a lifeline. She was not graceful. She would never be graceful on horseback. She understood this about herself with the clarity of someone who'd made peace with physical reality. But she was functional, and functional was what she needed. Cole watched her ride from across the yard one afternoon and said nothing. But when she came in, he poured her a cup of coffee without being asked and set it on the table in front of her, which she'd come to understand was his version of a compliment. It was Ruiz who told her about the men who'd come asking questions. He said it the way he said most things, sideways, without preamble, while he was doing something else entirely. They were checking the hay supply in the barn, counting bales and noting the moisture situation in the northwest corner that was going to need addressing before the next month. When he said, "2 men rode in from the South Road yesterday, while you and Cole were in town." Hannah kept her hand on the hay bale she was checking. "What kind of men?" "Lawyer type. One of them. Other one? Hired. You can tell." He pulled a handful of hay from a bale and smelled it, made a sound that indicated the moisture was worse than they'd noted. They were asking Pete about the ranch, who worked here, how long Cole had owned the property, whether there'd been any changes recently, whether a woman had moved in. He didn't ask that way, but yes. Hannah let out a breath through her nose. "What did Pete say?" "Pete said it was private business and offered to get Cole." A pause. "They left." "Thank you for telling me." Ruiz looked at her. He had the kind of face that had been weathered past the point of easy reading, but she'd been learning him for a month and she thought she saw something in it. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. The look of someone who understood what it was to be looked for. "Pete handled it fine," he said. "He doesn't know what it's about. I didn't tell him." "You know what it's about." "I know enough." He turned back to the hay. "Cole will want to know." "I'll tell him tonight." She told Cole that evening after supper, when Pete and Ruiz had gone to the bunkhouse and Vera had retired and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet. She sat across from him at the kitchen table and gave him the information plainly. 2 men, one a lawyer by appearance, asking about the ranch and its occupants. Cole listened without interrupting. He had a habit when he was thinking hard of turning a coffee cup in slow circles on the table, not drinking from it, just turning it. And she watched him do this while she talked. "He's moving faster than I expected," she said when she'd finished. "How long do you think before he arrives in person?" "I don't know. Victor likes to have everything arranged before he shows up. He doesn't walk into rooms unprepared. If he's sending lawyers ahead, it means he's building something." She looked at the table. "He'll have a story. He always has a story. In Philadelphia, it was that I was unwell. Mentally, he meant, though he'd never say it so directly. And that I needed proper care. He has a doctor who'll say whatever he needs said. Cole stopped turning the cup. He tried to have you committed? He tried to establish the foundation for it. He never filed anything before I left, but he'd laid the groundwork. She kept her voice flat, reporting, He's not stupid, Victor. That's the thing you need to understand. He doesn't come at you head on. He builds a structure around you until you realize you're inside it. Cole was quiet for a long moment. What does he want? He said. With you specifically, after all this time. It's been how long? 14 months since I left Philadelphia. Why would a man chase a woman across the country for 14 months? Because she left. Hannah looked up and met his eyes. For Victor, the leaving is what matters. A woman who leaves makes him look like a man who can't hold on to what's his. He can't let that stand. So this isn't about you. It's partly about me. He has a particular fixation. I can't entirely explain it. She chose her next words carefully. I think I represented something to him, an acquisition, something to complete a picture he had of himself. And I disrupted that picture, and he's not the kind of man who tolerates disruption. Cole looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he said, I'm going to talk to Walt tomorrow. I know you said that before. I mean it this time, with more specifics. Walt's a good sheriff, Hannah said. But Victor's lawyers can outmaneuver a local sheriff in their sleep. Maybe, but Walt's been in this county for 15 years and he knows things lawyers don't know. Cole pushed back from the table. And I want to talk to Aldridge. I want to know if that offer on the Grady place has moved forward. If it has, then we know for certain it's him. Hannah nodded. She was tired, bone-tired in the way she got when she'd been holding something tightly for too long. She wanted to go to her room and sleep without thinking, which she suspected wasn't going to happen, but she wanted it anyway. Thank you, she said, for taking this seriously. Cole looked at her with that expression again, the one she couldn't entirely read. Did you think I wouldn't? She answered honestly. I didn't know. He nodded, as if this was a reasonable thing to say. Go get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow's going to be a full day. She didn't sleep well, but she slept. Some hours of it were genuine rest, and some of it was the half-conscious sorting that happened when her brain decided morning was close enough to start processing. She woke before the alarm of the rooster and lay in the gray pre-light and thought about the shape of her situation. Victor Hale had money. He had lawyers. He had a doctor willing to testify on his behalf. He had the social credibility of a Philadelphia businessman with old connections and the specific, quiet power of a man no one had ever seriously challenged. She had a room in someone else's house, a few weeks of goodwill from people who didn't know her well, and a set of records in a box under her mattress. The mathematics were not in her favor, but she'd been in situations where the mathematics were not in her favor before. She thought about what she actually had, not just the material things, but the intangibles. She knew Victor's methods, which meant she could anticipate them. She had documentation he didn't know existed. She had people here who'd seen her work, who'd watched her prove herself in small ways over weeks, and that kind of testimony was harder to discredit than a piece of paper. She also had, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, the beginnings of something she could call a community. Grudging and imperfect as it was, Vera's pointed neutrality, Pete's enthusiastic tutelage, Ruiz's sideways recognition, Cole's careful, practical decency. Even Dora Finch at the general store, who'd held her letter at arm's length, but had also been the one to sit with her on that first terrible afternoon and pour her terrible coffee without making her feel like a problem. These were not nothing. She got up before sunrise and went to help with breakfast, and didn't say anything about what she'd been thinking, because it wasn't ready yet. It was still a shape without edges. She was standing at the stove turning bacon when she heard horses coming into the yard. More than one. The hour made it unusual. She set down the fork and went to the window. 2 riders. One of them was Walt Briggs, the sheriff. She recognized his horse, a distinctive paint that she'd noticed outside the jail on her trips into town. The other rider was a man she didn't know, heavy-set and square-jawed, riding a bay. Cole was already outside by the time she reached the door. She stood on the porch and watched. Walt climbed down from his horse, with the deliberate efficiency of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. He had a weathered, flat face and eyes that didn't miss much, and he'd been politely cautious with Hannah the 2 times they'd met in town. Not unfriendly, but holding judgment, which she respected. "Morning, Cole," he said. "Sorry for the hour." "What's happened?" Walt glanced toward Hannah on the porch, then back at Cole. "There was a man in town yesterday afternoon asking about your property, about your ownership record specifically, and about any guests you might have." He said guests with a careful flatness that suggested he knew it was the wrong word but couldn't find a better one. "He went to see Aldridge afterward. I don't know what they discussed." "Who was he?" "He gave his name as Hessler, Edward Hessler." Walt paused. "He's a lawyer out of Philadelphia." Hannah felt the porch railing under her hand and held on to it. Hessler. The same name her old employer had written in that letter 14 months ago. A lawyer named Hessler came asking questions. "This is about Miss Whitmore," Cole said. It wasn't a question. "I think so, yes." Walt looked toward Hannah again. "Miss Whitmore, I don't want to alarm you, but I think you and I should have a conversation, and I think sooner is better than later." Hannah let go of the railing and came down the steps. "All right, Sheriff," she said. "Let me get you some coffee first. It's better than what Dora Finch makes." Walt almost smiled. "I've had Dora's coffee. You won't have a hard time improving on it." She went inside and poured 3 cups, and while she stood at the counter, she made herself breathe slowly and steadily and think about what she was going to say and how she was going to say it, and what she was going to hold back and what she needed to give up in order to be believed. Victor was here, or nearly here. His lawyer was here, which meant Victor wasn't far behind. She picked up the 3 cups and carried them out to the porch, where Cole and Walt were talking in low voices that stopped when she appeared. She handed the cups over and sat down on the porch steps because there weren't enough chairs, and she looked out at the yard where the gray mare Patience was moving slowly along the fence line, and she thought, "You've been running for 14 months, and there's nowhere left to run to, so stop running." She turned to the sheriff. "What do you need to know?" she said. Walt Briggs was a more careful man than she'd initially given him credit for. He asked his questions in a methodical order that told her he'd been thinking about this before he arrived, working backward from what he knew to establish what he needed to verify. He didn't interrupt her when she talked, and he didn't react visibly to anything she said, which was the professional version of a poker face and considerably more reassuring than the sympathetic reactions people sometimes gave that were really just their own discomfort at hearing difficult things. She told him the whole story, more than she'd told Cole, because the sheriff needed the legal specifics that Cole didn't need to carry. She told him about the doctor who'd been prepared to file a statement about her mental competence. She told him about the 2 attempts, separated by 4 months, in which Victor had tried to have her physically returned to his custody, using arguments about her well-being. She told him about the papers she had and what they demonstrated, and which of them might have legal weight in a territorial court. Walt listened. He wrote things down in a small notebook with a pencil he kept behind his ear. When she finished, he looked at his notes for a moment, and then he said, "Has this man Hale threatened you directly, in writing?" "Not in the letter I received," Hannah said. "He's too careful for that. But the lawyer's presence constitutes something." "It constitutes something. Whether it constitutes something actionable, I don't know." "I know a judge in the county seat," Walt said. "Hale Martin. Solid man, been on the bench 12 years. If this gets to a courtroom, you want it in front of Martin." "You think it will get to a courtroom?" Walt looked at her with the flat steadiness of a man who didn't believe in telling people comfortable things. A man who sends a Philadelphia lawyer to a frontier territory isn't doing it for the scenery, he said. "Yes, I think it will." Hannah looked at her coffee cup. "All right," she said. Cole had been quiet through most of the conversation, which she'd noticed. He spoke now. "What can you do in the meantime?" "Keep an eye on Hessler. Make sure he understands that Red Mesa has a functioning law office." Walt stood up, tucking the notebook away. "Miss Whitmore, I want you to bring me those documents. Not copies, the originals. I want them somewhere secure." "I'll get them today." "Good." He picked up his hat. "One more thing. If Hale himself arrives in town, I want to know immediately. Don't wait. Don't try to handle it without telling me. You understand?" "Yes," Hannah said. Walt nodded once and went to his horse. Hannah sat on the porch steps after he rode out and held her empty coffee cup and let the morning be what it was. Cool, Clear, the smell of the bacon she'd abandoned still drifting through the door behind her, the mare still moving along the fence in her unhurried way. Cole sat down on the step beside her. There was a moment of quiet between them that wasn't uncomfortable. "You doing all right?" he said. The question was simple, and she almost deflected it the way she deflected most things that touched the center. Instead, she said, "I've been better. I've been worse. Right now, I'm somewhere in between." "That's about where I'd put us," he said. She looked at him. He was looking out at the yard, at patients moving along the fence, at the early light just catching the roof of the barn. "I'm sorry I brought this to your door," she said. "You didn't bring it. He did. He followed me. That's not the same as you bringing it." He looked at her sideways. "Stop apologizing for things that aren't your fault." "It's a bad habit." She almost said, "I know." Instead, she said, "I'm working on it." He made that sound again. The almost laugh that was his version of something warmer. She'd been collecting those without entirely meaning to. She got up and went inside to rescue the bacon before it became something else. And she thought about Victor Hale somewhere between here and there, moving through the territory with his lawyer and his plans and his absolute certainty that she would eventually run out of places to go. She thought about the mare at the fence and the north fence line that had been fixed on a Tuesday and the ledgers she understood better every week and the small, accumulating weight of things she'd built here. She was not done yet. She was in fact just beginning. Victor Hale arrived on a Friday. Hannah knew, before she saw him, the way you sometimes know things that your body registers before your mind catches up. She was at the general store when she felt the shift. A subtle change in the room's atmosphere, the way a conversation near the door stopped and then restarted in a lower key. She turned and looked through the window and saw the coach pulling up in front of the hotel. And even from that distance, even seeing only the line of his shoulders as he stepped down, she knew. She set her flower on Dora's counter and said, "I need to go." Dora looked through the window. "Who is that?" "Someone I was hoping wouldn't come." She left exact change on the counter, which she'd never done before, and went out the back. She walked to the sheriff's office first, because that was what Walt had told her to do. Walt was at his desk, and he read her face before she said a word. "He's here," Walt said. "Just arrived, at the hotel." "All right." Walt stood and reached for his hat with the unhurried efficiency of someone who decided how this was going to go before it started. "Go back to the ranch. Don't ride through town if you can help it. Take the East Road." "You're going to speak to him?" "I'm going to introduce myself." Walt said it in the mild tone of a man who meant something less mild. "That's all, for now." She took the East Road back to the ranch and rode Patience at a pace that was faster than the mare preferred, which Patience communicated through a series of opinions that Hannah felt through the saddle. She didn't slow down. By the time she got back, Cole was in the yard with Ruiz, doing something to a wagon wheel that required both of them and most of their attention. He looked up when she came in. She said, "Victor's in town." Cole straightened. He and Ruiz exchanged a look. The brief, wordless communication of men who'd worked alongside each other long enough to have their own shorthand. Then Ruiz took the wagon wheel and Cole came toward her. "You talked to Walt?" "On my way back, he said he'd go introduce himself." Cole helped her down from the horse, which she usually managed herself but didn't argue about this time. "Good," he said. "Come inside." That evening, Cole sat at the kitchen table for a long time after supper, turning his coffee cup in those slow circles. Hannah pretended to read and watched him without watching him. "There's something I need to say," Cole said finally. "And I want you to hear me out before you answer." Hannah put down the book. He wasn't looking at her directly. He was looking at a point on the table slightly to the left of her hands, which she'd noticed was what he did when he was working towards something that mattered. "Victor Hale has money and lawyers and a story he's been building for over a year," he said. "Walt can keep him honest while he's in town, but Walt can't stop a man from filing papers in a territorial court. And if Hale files, if he gets a judge to look at a case about your mental competence or about some breach of a contract your father made, you need to be in a strong position." "I know," Hannah said. "You're living in a man's house, unchaperoned." He said it plainly, without embarrassment. "In Philadelphia, that doesn't matter much in educated circles. Out here, it matters in a courtroom. A lawyer could make something of it." Hannah looked at her hands. "I know that too. So here's what I'm thinking." He paused. "We get married." The kitchen was very quiet. Vera was not in it. She'd gone to bed an hour ago. But Hannah had the sudden irrational sense that the walls were listening. "Cole?" she said. "Not for... I'm not saying..." He stopped and started again, more carefully. "I'm saying it as a practical matter. If you're my wife, Hale's argument about your situation here falls apart. You'd have legal standing. You'd have my name and my property behind you. His case gets considerably harder to make." Hannah looked at him. He was looking at the table still, which meant he was serious. When Cole was trying to read a room, he looked at faces. When he was thinking his own thoughts, he looked away. "And what would you get out of this?" she said. He finally looked up. "I don't need to get something out of it." "That's not an answer." He held her gaze. "I get to sleep knowing I did the right thing," he said. "I get a wife who knows my ledgers better than I do, which is not nothing. And I get..." He stopped. "I don't know. I get to see what happens. Isn't that enough for now?" It was the most honest thing he could have said, and she suspected he knew that, and she suspected that was why he said it instead of something more polished. She thought about everything she knew about this man. 7 weeks of watching him, the way he treated Pete and Ruiz, the way he talked to his horses, the way he'd told her to stop apologizing for things that weren't her fault, the way he hadn't flinched when she'd told him about the bruises, just gone very still and let the information settle and then asked what she needed. She thought about what a marriage of convenience would mean in practical terms and in complicated ones. She thought about what it would mean to owe someone this much and whether that debt was different from the debt she already carried. "If we do this," she said slowly, "I need you to understand that I'm not going to pretend it's something it isn't. I've done enough of that. I'm not asking you to pretend anything. And if it becomes something else, or doesn't, I need to know we can be honest with each other about that." "That's what I'd want too." She looked at him across the table. Outside, the wind moved through the grass in its constant way. Somewhere in the barn, a horse made a sound and then went quiet. "All right," she said. Cole exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding something. "All right," he said back. "I'll go see the Reverend tomorrow." "The judge," Hannah said. "Not the Reverend. A legal record is what we need, not a ceremony." "The judge, then." They sat for a moment in the oddly settled quiet of two people who have just agreed to something significant and haven't yet figured out what to do with their hands. "For what it's worth," Cole said, "I think it's a good idea." "For what it's worth," Hannah said, "I think you might be right. But check." They were married 4 days later in Judge Hale Martin's office at the county seat, which was a 20-minute ride from Red Mesa. The judge was a solid, gray-haired man with a dry manner and extremely clean fingernails who read the relevant words from a law book in a voice that suggested he'd done this many times and would do it many times more. Ruiz and Pete came as witnesses. Pete was visibly moved in a way he kept trying to conceal. Ruiz was not visibly anything, which was his baseline. Hannah wore her second-best dress, which was the navy one with the small collar, because her best dress had a tear in the hem she hadn't gotten around to fixing. She'd pinned her hair up, and Vera had looked at her that morning with an expression that was, for Vera, practically sentimental. "You'll do," Vera had said. Hannah had taken this as the highest available compliment. Cole wore a clean shirt and his better hat and looked like a man who was making an effort and wasn't entirely sure it was sufficient. It was sufficient. Hannah didn't say this because it would have embarrassed him, but she noted it. They signed the papers. The judge shook their hands with the perfunctory warmth of someone for whom this transaction was routine. Pete shook Cole's hand and then, after a moment of obvious internal deliberation, shook Hannah's hand too. Ruiz shook both their hands without any internal deliberation visible whatsoever. On the ride back to Red Mesa, Hannah held the copy of their marriage certificate in her lap and watched the territory pass and felt the strangeness of it. The odd, untethered sensation of a day that had changed something fundamental while the world around it continued exactly as it had been. "You're quiet," Cole said. "I'm thinking." "About?" "About how it doesn't feel like anything yet." She glanced at him. "I don't know what I expected it to feel like." "It'll feel like something when we get back to town," Cole said. "I told Walt this morning. Word will have moved by now." He was right about that. Word had moved. Hannah felt it when they rode into Red Mesa that afternoon. The way attention gathered and then redistributed itself. Conversations pausing and resuming, eyes following them down the main street. She kept her back straight and her gaze forward and reminded herself that she'd been stared at her whole life and hadn't died of it yet. They stopped in front of the general store because they needed flour, and because Hannah thought it was better to walk into it than to avoid it. Dora Finch was behind the counter and looked up when they came in, and her expression went through several things quickly before landing on something that was genuinely warm. "I heard," Dora said. "Congratulations." "Thank you, Dora," Cole said. Dora looked at Hannah with a directness that wasn't unkind. "You all right?" "I'm fine," Hannah said. "We need flour and salt, and if you have it, that pepper I asked about last week." "I got it in," Dora said. She was already reaching for the shelf. "The pepper, I mean, costs more than it should, but that's the trade wagon for you." She wrapped their order efficiently, and as she handed it over, she lowered her voice slightly and said, "He was in here this morning, Victor Hale." Hannah held very still. "He was asking about you," Dora said. Politely, that particular kind of polite that isn't actually polite. She looked at Cole. "I told him Miss Whitmore, Mrs. Brennan, was a capable woman who'd made her own choices and didn't require anyone's concern." Cole looked at Dora Finch with an expression Hannah didn't often see on his face, which was simple gratitude. "Thank you, Dora." "Don't thank me. Man rubbed me wrong from the moment he walked in." She tucked a corner of brown paper under the parcel. "He's staying at the hotel. Been there 3 days and he's made exactly the number of friends you'd expect." Which was to say, none. Hannah took her parcel and Cole held the door and they came out into the afternoon light, and she thought, so he's already starting. Already building his picture of her situation, gathering information, turning over stones. 2 hours later, Victor Hale found them. They were at the livery, tying off the horses before the ride back, when Hannah heard footsteps behind her and turned. And there he was, 14 months. He looked exactly the same, which was somehow more disturbing than if he'd changed. Victor Hale was 52 years old, built with the comfortable solidity of a man who'd never had to do physical work, with silver at his temples and a dark coat that was too formal for this territory, and hands that were very clean. His face was arranged in an expression of measured concern that she recognized immediately. It was his public face, the face he wore when other people were watching. "Hannah," he said, "I'm relieved to see you well." "Mr. Hale," she said. Cole was beside her, and she felt him go still in the particular way he went still when something required his attention. Not tense exactly, present. Victor's eyes moved to Cole with the assessment of a man who'd been measuring people against invisible standards his entire life. "You must be Mr. Brennan," he said. "I've heard a great deal about you." "I haven't heard much about you," Cole said. "Only recently." "I imagine." Victor's attention returned to Hannah. "I've been worried, my dear. The circumstances you left in, abruptly, without word. I've simply been trying to satisfy myself that you're safe." "I'm safe," Hannah said, "and well cared for." He said it with a warmth that had knives in it. "I understand congratulations are in order. A sudden marriage." A pause. "Quite sudden." "People marry," Hannah said. "They do." Victor's eyes moved between them, reading something, filing it away. "I'd like the opportunity to speak with you privately, Hannah, simply to reassure myself. You understand, I'm sure that your father, given his concerns, would want—" "My father's concerns are between him and you," Hannah said. "They stopped being my concern when I left Philadelphia." Victor's expression shifted very slightly, a small movement around the eyes that wouldn't have meant anything to most people. Hannah had spent 2 years learning to read it. It meant that she'd said something he'd file and use later. "Of course," he said. He looked at Cole. "Mr. Brennan, I wonder if I might call on you at your ranch, formally, simply to speak, man to man." "You're welcome to come to the ranch," Cole said. "Hannah and I are usually there most days." Victor's expression acknowledged the message with the smoothness of long practice. "Together," he said, as if tasting the word. "Yes, of course." He touched his hat, a small, precise gesture. "I'll be in touch. Hannah, it was good to see you looking so well." He walked away in the direction of the hotel. Hannah watched him go. Her hands were entirely steady, which surprised her. A year ago, her hands would have been shaking. She wasn't sure if that meant she'd gotten braver or just more tired of being afraid. "That's him," she said, unnecessarily. "Yeah," Cole said. He was still watching the retreating figure. "I understand now." "What do you understand?" "What you meant about him building a structure." He turned to look at her. Every word he said was for someone who wasn't in the conversation. "Everything Victor does is for the audience he's planning on," Hannah said. "He's been practicing that performance for months." Walt Briggs came to the ranch the next morning. He sat at the kitchen table and drank Vera's coffee, which was significantly better than Dora's, and laid out what he knew. Victor Hale had met with Aldridge the previous afternoon. Aldridge, who was not a man of strong loyalties but was a man of strong self-interest, had told Walt about the meeting afterward, which suggested he'd made a calculation about which way things were going to go. Victor had presented a document, a claim essentially, that Hannah had left Philadelphia in violation of a legal contract between her father and Victor, and that her marriage to Cole Brennan was potentially invalid given the terms of that arrangement. Hannah listened to this without blinking. "A contract between her father and Victor Hale is not a contract she signed," Cole said. "That's exactly right," Walt said. "And in this territory, that argument should have no legal standing. The problem is that Hale's lawyer, Hessler, is very good, and very good lawyers can make bad arguments look better than they are for long enough to cause significant damage." "What kind of damage?" Hannah said. "He could file an injunction questioning the validity of your marriage. He could file a petition regarding your legal status and competence, which you mentioned he'd laid groundwork for in Philadelphia. Either of those buys him time and puts you in a defensive position." Walt looked at her steadily. "He can't win those arguments, but he can make winning them costly." "Costly how?" "Money, time, reputation." Walt looked at Cole. "You'd be tied up in legal proceedings that would affect the ranch's operations. Your credit with the suppliers, people's willingness to do business with you while there's a question mark over your household." Cole was quiet. Hannah watched his face and saw him working through it. "He's counting on us not having the stomach for the fight," Cole said. "That's my read," Walt said. "Then he doesn't know us well enough yet," Cole said. He looked at Hannah. "Do we have what we need to fight it? The documents you gave Walt, is that enough?" "It's a start," Hannah said. She'd been thinking about this since the encounter at the livery. "We need more than documents. We need people who know me, who've watched me work here these last weeks. Testimony isn't just paper." "Pete and Ruiz would speak for you," Cole said. "Dora Finch," Walt said. "She's already shown her opinion," Hannah thought. "We need the judge to understand what Victor's case actually is. Not what it says on paper, but what it's designed to do. A judge who's seen this kind of thing before." "Hale Martin," Walt said. "He's who we want. He's also who we'll get if I can get the case routed correctly." He paused. "There's one more thing. The Grady property." "Did Hale make an offer?" Cole said. "He did, through Hessler, but Emmett's brother, the one in Missouri, responded to a letter I sent him last week. He's not selling. His health has improved, and he's coming out in 2 months to see the property himself." Walt allowed himself a small, satisfied expression. Took away one of Hale's footholds. Hannah felt something loosen in her chest. The Grady property had been bothering her more than she'd said. The idea of Victor establishing himself on adjacent land, becoming a permanent fixture in this territory. "That's good news," she said. "It's one piece," Walt said. "Don't relax yet." She wasn't relaxing. She was cataloging, building her own picture of the board, the same way she built a picture of a ledger, understanding what each entry meant in relation to the others. Victor was going to file something, probably soon, before they had more time to prepare. He'd try to create the impression of chaos around their household. 2 people who'd married hastily, a woman with a contested past, a man with an operation that could be disrupted by legal uncertainty. He'd let the process itself be the punishment, unless they made the process work the other way. Walt left after his second cup of coffee. Hannah sat for a minute after he went, looking at the table. "You're thinking hard," Cole said. "I need to talk to some people," Hannah said. "People in town, not just the ones who already know me." She looked up at him. "When Victor files his case, and he will, he's going to try to make the story about me, about who I am, what I'm capable of, whether I can be trusted to know my own mind. I want people in that courtroom who've watched me over these weeks, not to defend me, to tell the truth. The truth is enough if enough people say it. Cole studied her. You're going to campaign for yourself. Not campaign, she thought of the right word. Testify. Before the courtroom. Out here, in ordinary life, in the way I work and what I say and whether people believe me. You've been doing that since the day you walked into Emmett's yard, Cole said. She hadn't thought of it that way. Then I need to keep doing it, she said, more deliberately. The next 2 weeks had a particular quality that she'd remember afterward, not dramatic in the way of the moments that bracketed them, but dense. Full. The kind of days that seem ordinary while you're in them and only later reveal themselves as the days when something was being built. She went to town more deliberately. She stopped in at the dressmaker's, not Margaret Holt's shop, but the simpler one run by a woman named Clara Ames who'd come west with her husband and stayed on after he'd died, the way women out here sometimes did. Clara was small and sharp-eyed and had the manner of someone who'd recalibrated her expectations of the world and found the new ones more honest. Hannah brought her ledger work on one visit. She was helping Aldridge's office sort out a surveying dispute because Aldridge had apparently decided that having Hannah's goodwill was the safer investment, and worked at Clara's table while Clara sewed, and they talked the way women talk when they're doing something else, which is to say they talked about the real things. I've seen men like Hale, Clara said at one point, her needle moving in the steady rhythm of someone who didn't need to think about the stitch. My late husband's business partner was that kind. Always perfectly reasonable, always concerned, always making you feel like you'd done something wrong by not being grateful for his interest. That's exactly right, Hannah said. You can't argue with the concern. It sounds like caring. It looks like caring, too, to people who haven't had their hands inside it. Clara bit off a thread. You should know that most of the people in this town are not stupid. They see him at the hotel. They see you at work. They can tell the difference between a man who's worried about a woman and a man who's hunting one. Hannah looked up from her column of numbers. Has he spoken to anyone in town? About me? He's spoken to several people, Clara said, without elaborating on how she knew this, and the conversations have all gone about the same way. He's polite and concerned, and people come away from it feeling like they've been shown a beautiful painting that had something slightly wrong with it that they couldn't identify. What do they say about me? Clara set down her work and looked at Hannah directly. That you work, that you don't complain, that you're hard to read, but you mean what you say. She paused. Mrs. Brennan. It was the first time anyone had called her that who wasn't involved in the legal paperwork. Hannah felt the words settle into a different place than she'd expected. Thank you, Clara, she said. But Victor's filing came on a Wednesday. Walt brought a copy to the ranch. It was 15 pages of very careful legal language that said, essentially, 4 things. That Hannah's departure from Philadelphia had violated a contractual obligation that existed between her father and Victor Hale. That Hannah's mental competence at the time of her departure was questionable, supported by a signed statement from a Dr. Ambrose Porter of Philadelphia. That her subsequent marriage to Cole Brennan had been entered into under duress and possibly under coercion, and that Victor Hale, as the aggrieved party, was seeking both a review of the marriage's validity and a determination of Hannah's legal status. Hannah read all 15 pages. She read them twice. Then she set them on the table very carefully and looked at the wall for a moment. Dr. Porter, Cole said. He'd read it over her shoulder. He's been Victor's physician for 20 years, Hannah said. He'll say whatever Victor needs him to say. Can we challenge his statement? We can. We need a counter-statement from another doctor. Someone with standing here, not in Philadelphia. She was already thinking. Or we bypass it. If we can demonstrate that the contract itself was invalid, that it was entered into without my knowledge or consent, then everything built on it collapses. How do we demonstrate that? My father, Hannah said. She hadn't said his name in weeks. My father signed that agreement. He'd have to testify to the circumstances of it. She looked at Cole. I don't know if he will. He's not a strong man and Victor has a hold on him. Could you write to him? I could. She considered this. I don't know what good it would do. Try it anyway, Cole said. You don't know what he'll say until you ask. She wrote the letter that evening. It was one of the harder things she'd written. 3 drafts before she found the version that said what needed saying without saying more than he could absorb, without the weight of the anger she'd been carrying, which would only make him close up and retreat. She wrote to him the way she'd once talked to him when she was small, and he was still the person she thought he was. Plainly, with the assumption that he was capable of doing right, even if he usually chose not to. She sealed it and gave it to Cole to post, and then she went and stood in the yard in the dark for a while and looked at the stars, which were out in their ridiculous abundance the way they always were out here, crowding the sky. She heard the door open behind her. Cole came and stood about 4 feet away, which was the distance he usually kept. Close enough to be present, far enough to give her room. She'd noticed he did this, and she'd appreciated it. "What happens if the court sides with him?" she said. She'd been not asking this for 2 weeks. "We appeal," Cole said. "And if we lose the appeal? We go to the territorial level, and above that, if we have to. That could take years." It could. She looked at the sky. "Would you do that? Spend years fighting this?" Cole was quiet for a moment, that honest pause of his. "I married you," he said. "I knew what that meant." She looked at him. In the dark, she could see the line of him, the hat, the shoulders, the particular stillness that was so characteristic of him that she'd started to find it steadying rather than unreadable. "I'm going to fight him," she said, "in court. I'm going to testify, and I'm going to tell the truth, and I'm going to trust that it's enough. It might not be. I know." She turned back to the sky. "But I've been surviving my whole life on strategies and exits and ways to make myself small enough to slip through. I'm tired of it." She heard her own voice come out with more edge than she'd intended and softened slightly. "I want to try the other thing, just once. Standing in a room and saying what happened and asking people to believe me." Cole was quiet for a beat, then that's what we'll do. She nearly told him she was grateful. She stopped herself because she'd been thinking about what gratitude meant. Not the word, but the reality of it, the weight of it. Whether gratitude between two people in their situation was something you said or something you just accumulated. She thought she'd let it accumulate for a while longer before she said it out loud. The hearing was set for the first week of June, 3 weeks away. And the town was watching, all of it, including the parts that hadn't made up their mind yet. And Hannah Whitmore Brennan was going to make sure that what they saw in those 3 weeks was worth watching. She went back inside. There was work to do. The 3 weeks before the hearing had a texture Hannah would remember long afterward. Not the dramatic quality of crisis, but the grinding daily weight of waiting. She woke early and worked and went to bed tired and lay awake anyway, running through arguments and counter-arguments in the dark, the way her mind insisted on doing when she couldn't afford to let it stop. She hadn't heard back from her father. She'd known she might not. She'd written the letter with full understanding that her father was a man who found difficult things easier to avoid than to face, and that Victor Hale had 14 months of careful cultivation working in his favor. Still, the silence had a specific quality, not the silence of someone who hadn't received a letter. The silence of someone who had and was making a choice. She let it go. Or rather, she put it in the category of things she couldn't change and moved her energy toward the things she could. Walt had found a physician in the county seat, a man named Dr. Thomas Garrett, who had 30 years of practice behind him and a reputation for saying what he observed rather than what was useful to his clients. He agreed to examine Hannah and provide a statement regarding her mental competence. She rode to his office on a Tuesday with Cole and sat in a small room that smelled of carbolic and answered questions for 2 hours while Dr. Garrett took notes in a handwriting that was almost illegible and asked follow-up questions that were sharp and occasionally unexpected. He asked about her childhood, her mother's illness, the years of running the household. He asked about the circumstances of her departure from Philadelphia, not with the loaded phrasing of a lawyer looking for a particular answer, but with the flat curiosity of a man assembling a picture. He asked how she slept, what she ate, whether she experienced periods of unusual elevated mood or unusual despair. He asked what she was afraid of, and she told him the truth, which was Victor Hale and financial insecurity, and in a smaller and less urgent way, failing at something she'd worked hard to prove she was capable of. "That's a very organized answer," Dr. Garrett said, looking up from his notes. "Is that relevant to your assessment?" "Disorganized thinking is one of the markers we look for," he said. "Your thinking is not disorganized. I'll note that." She rode back to the ranch feeling strangely wrung out, the way you feel after an examination that requires you to look directly at yourself without the usual softening. The counter-statement from Dr. Garrett arrived at Walt's office 4 days before the hearing. Walt sent word that it was thorough and, in his word, conclusive. Hannah felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for weeks. 5 days before the hearing, Ruiz came to her in the early morning while she was bringing feed to the horses. He didn't say anything immediately, which was normal for Ruiz. He took a bucket from her and started on the far stall while she did the near ones, and for 2 or 3 minutes there was just the sound of feed hitting the pail and the horses moving and the ordinary noise of a ranch in the morning. Then he said, "There were men on the south fence last night." Hannah stopped. "What men?" "2, maybe 3. Hard to tell in the dark. I found the marks this morning. So horses had stood for a while in one place, then moved east along the property line." He worked his way to the next stall. They didn't come onto the land, but they wanted it known they'd been there. Hannah thought about this carefully. "You didn't tell Cole yet?" "I'm telling you first." He said it without explanation, which she understood to mean he had a reason for the order. "The question is whether this is Hale trying to unsettle you before the hearing, or whether it's something that needs to be treated as an actual threat." "What's your read?" Ruiz considered. "The men didn't do anything. Men who intend something don't stand around watching. These men wanted to be noticed." He paused. "Victor Hale strikes me as a man who likes to rattle a door before he tries to open it." "He is," Hannah said. She thought about the weeks before she'd left Philadelphia. The small disruptions, the things slightly out of place, the sense of being watched that she'd dismissed as paranoia before understanding it was information. "He's trying to make me feel surrounded." "Does it work?" "It used to." She finished the last stall and hung the empty bucket on its hook. "Tell Cole. He should know about the fence, and Walt." "I'll tell Cole," Ruiz said. "You tell Walt." She rode into town that morning and told Walt, who listened with the focused stillness of a man filing information in a precise internal system. He said he'd put a watch on the South Road, and he said it without drama, the way he said most things. She was on her way back out when she nearly walked into Victor Hale on the boardwalk outside the post office. It was the first time she'd seen him since the livery, and the proximity of it, 2 feet of boardwalk between them, made something cold move through her before she locked it down. He looked the same. He always looked the same. That was part of it. "Hannah," he said, the concerned warmth fully deployed. "You look tired." "I'm fine," she said. She didn't step back. She'd practiced this, literally practiced it, in her room, deciding ahead of time not to give ground physically, because she'd given ground physically to this man for 2 years, and she was finished with it. "I hope you understand that nothing I've done is personal," Victor said. He said it in the tone of someone sharing difficult but necessary wisdom. "I've simply been concerned. Your father is concerned. When a young woman makes decisions quickly, under difficult circumstances. Mr. Hale." She kept her voice at a conversational level, which took more effort than it should have. "We'll have an opportunity to make our respective arguments in front of Judge Martin in 5 days. I'd prefer to save it for then." Victor's eyes, pale gray, always slightly calculating even when the rest of his face was warm, moved over her with the particular attention of someone looking for cracks. "You've changed," he said. "Out here. You're harder." "Yes," Hannah said. "I am." She walked past him and didn't look back. Her hands were shaking by the time she reached her horse. She stood with one hand on the saddle and breathed until they stopped, then mounted and rode back toward the ranch. "You've changed. You're harder." He'd meant it as a criticism. She was taking it as a report. The hearing was held in the Red Mesa Courthouse, which was a single room attached to the back of the sheriff's office that served multiple purposes and smelled permanently of old paper and boot leather. Judge Hale Martin had ridden in the day before and was staying at the hotel, which meant he and Victor Hale had presumably passed each other in the hallway, and Hannah allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction imagining Victor's face when he realized who the judge was. Martin was not a man who could be impressed by Philadelphia money. He was a man who'd been impressed a long time ago by enough hard cases to have stopped being impressible by much of anything. The room filled. Hannah hadn't expected that. Red Mesa had approximately 200 residents in the town proper, and it seemed like most of them had found a reason to be in or near the courthouse by 9 in the morning. Walt had anticipated this and opened the windows so people could hear from outside, which was not standard procedure and was very much Walt. She sat at a table beside Walt and their lawyer, a man named Connell, who had a thin, precise face and had reviewed all of Hannah's documents 3 times and told her they had a strong case with the flat certainty of someone who would also tell her if they didn't. Cole sat behind her with Pete and Ruiz. She felt them there without looking. Hessler was at the other table. Victor Hale sat beside him, in the dark coat, impeccably composed. Judge Martin came in and the room settled. The opening arguments took an hour. Hessler was as good as advertised. He built his case with the careful logic of someone constructing a building, each piece supporting the next, the whole structure designed to look inevitable. The contract, Hannah's departure, the hasty marriage, the questionable circumstances of her life in the territory. Dr. Porter's statement, which was read aloud and which Hannah sat through with her hands flat on the table in front of her and her face as still as she could make it. The contract had existed. Her father had signed it. She had left without honoring it. Victor Hale had suffered a breach of agreement and a personal injury and was seeking remedy. Then Connell stood up. He was quieter than Hessler and less architecturally elegant, but he was precise in a different way, the way of someone who has found the single structural flaw in the building and intends to press on it until the whole thing comes apart. The contract, Connell argued, was legally unenforceable on its face. A woman was not a property that could be contracted. Any agreement made regarding her person without her knowledge or consent had no legal standing in this territory, and arguably in any territory. Dr. Porter's statement was the testimony of a physician employed by Victor Hale regarding a patient he had seen under circumstances entirely controlled by Victor Hale. And Hannah Whitmore Brennan was present in this courtroom, married of her own free will, employed in legitimate work, possessed of full mental clarity, and prepared to testify to all of this herself. Judge Martin looked at Hannah over the top of his spectacles. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, "you'll take the stand." She stood. She'd thought about this moment for 3 weeks. She'd considered how to dress, how to hold herself, whether to look at the judge or the room or Victor. She'd rehearsed answers to the questions Connell had prepared her for, and tried to anticipate the ones Hessler would ask that she couldn't prepare for. But when she was actually standing in front of the room, the packed, hot, attentive room with its smell of old paper and its windows open to the June morning, she found that what she had prepared and what she actually needed were 2 different things. She told the truth, not the organized, strategic version she'd rehearsed, the actual truth in the order it had happened: her mother's illness, her father's debt, the dinner at which an agreement had been made about her future without anyone asking her about it, the 2 years of trying to understand whether what was being asked of her was reasonable, of giving Victor the benefit of increasingly strained doubt, of the night she'd understood that what was being built around her was not a home, but a cage, and that she had to leave before the last door closed. She told the courtroom about the 14 months, about moving from place to place, about the dry goods merchant and the cousin's spare room, and the sewing work and the ledger work and the careful, grinding effort of staying gone, about Emmett Grady's advertisement and what it had offered that was different from everything else. Not rescue, but partnership. A request for someone capable, not someone compliant. She said she had come west to build something. She had arrived and found tragedy and grief and a town that had looked at her and decided what she was before she had a chance to show them. She had built something anyway, records and relationships and a knowledge of this land and this ranch that she was prepared to defend in any detail. She talked about Cole, not romantically, not with the soft edges of a performance. She talked about him the way she thought about him, which was plainly and with specific evidence. He had offered her a room and work when she had nothing. He had listened when she spoke. He had stood beside her when it cost him something. They had married quickly and for practical reasons, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But she was also not going to pretend that what had developed in the months since was nothing, because it was not nothing, and she had stopped lying about things to make other people comfortable. She said, "I am not a woman who lost her mind and ran from a man who was good to her. I am a woman who understood her situation clearly and made a rational decision to leave it. The fact that my decision was inconvenient to someone else does not make it a symptom." The room was very quiet. Hessler's cross-examination was aggressive in the specific way of someone who'd realized the direct approach wasn't working and had shifted to destabilization. He questioned her account of events. He suggested her memory might be distorted by emotional distress. He pressed on the speed of the marriage, the convenience of it, what a cynical person might say about a woman with no resources and a man with property. Hannah answered each question without raising her voice. She had spent 2 years in the company of a man who used language as a weapon, and she had learned eventually to refuse to fight on that ground. Then Ruiz testified. He sat in the witness chair with the specific dignity of a man who had no interest in performing dignity and described, in his flat, unhurried way, what he had observed over the course of 2 months. Hannah's work ethic, her accuracy, the way she had learned things she had not known and learned them without complaint and without shortcuts. He described the night riders on the south fence and said he believed, based on everything he'd observed, that they were designed to intimidate rather than threaten. Hessler tried to question Ruiz's credibility. Ruiz looked at him with the steady patience of someone who had encountered many varieties of dismissal in his life and found all of them equally unimpressive. He answered the questions with the same flatness he'd used with Connell. There was no gap between the versions. There was only the one version, which was what had happened. Pete testified about the ledgers and the livestock records. Dora Finch testified about Hannah's first day in Red Mesa, how she'd sat in the store and absorbed terrible news and then gotten up and made a plan. Clara Ames testified about the weeks of ordinary work she'd observed, the conversation they'd had about Victor, the way a town comes to know a person through accumulated ordinary evidence. Then Walt Briggs testified about the men on the south fence line, about the lawyer Hessler's arrival in Red Mesa before Victor had even presented himself, about the offer on the Grady property and the timing of it. He laid it out with the patience and precision of someone who had waited a long time to say this in a room where it would be heard properly. He said, "I've been in law enforcement for 15 years and I know the difference between a man looking for a woman's welfare and a man looking to recover something he considers his property. I've been watching Victor Hale since he arrived in this territory. I know which one he is." Victor's face, through all of this, maintained the concerned dignity he'd worn since the day he arrived. He made notes on a piece of paper in front of him. He whispered occasionally to Hessler. He looked at Hannah with an expression of measured sadness that she recognized as his final argument. The performance of a wronged man who bore no malice, who only wanted what was right. She looked back at him without expression. She'd stopped being afraid of his face about 3 weeks ago, and she found the absence of that fear remarkable, like putting down something you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten the weight of it until you let it go. Judge Martin recessed for an hour. Hannah sat outside on the step of the courthouse in the June heat, with Cole beside her and Ruiz on her other side and Pete 3 feet away pretending not to hover, and she thought about nothing in particular, which was the most efficient use of that hour. "How do you think it went?" Pete said, to no one specifically. "Pete," Ruiz said. "Right," Pete said. "Sorry." Cole said nothing. He sat with his forearms on his knees and looked at the street, and occasionally she was aware of him looking at her instead, but she didn't turn to meet it because she was trying very hard not to need the reassurance. The hour passed. They went back inside. Judge Martin came in and the room went still. He looked at his notes for a moment, or appeared to. Hannah had the impression he'd already made up his mind, and the looking at notes was the considered pause of a man who respected the gravity of what he was about to say. "The petition filed by Mr. Victor Hale is denied," he said, "in its entirety." He looked up. He was looking at Hannah. Any agreement entered into regarding this woman's person, without her knowledge or participation, has no standing in this court or any court in this territory. Her marriage to Cole Brennan is legal, valid, and recognized. Her mental competence is established and unchallenged by credible evidence. The matter is closed. He looked at Victor Hale then for a long moment. "Mr. Hale," he said, "I'd recommend returning east." He didn't say it as a threat. He said it the way you say something that is plainly, obviously, unambiguously true, and the weight of it was in that plainness. The room exhaled. Hannah sat very still. She had not let herself anticipate this moment because she'd been afraid of what it would feel like if it went the other way. And now that it had gone the right way, she didn't entirely know what to do with it. She felt Cole's hand cover hers on the table, just for a second, just a brief, solid pressure, and then he took it away. And she pressed her palm flat against the wood and held it there. Around her the room was moving, people standing and talking, Pete saying something loud to Ruiz that Ruiz was ignoring, Walt nodding at her from across the room with the economical satisfaction of a man who'd done what he set out to do. At the other table, Hessler was already packing his papers with the brisk efficiency of a man whose next engagement was elsewhere. Victor Hale sat for a moment after Hessler began moving. He sat with his hands folded and his composure intact, the last available expression of control, to be the one who chose when to stand. Then he stood. He looked at Hannah once, across the room. Not the concerned warmth, not the measured sadness. Something more honest than that, and less comfortable. The look of a man who has encountered a wall where he expected an open door. She held his gaze and felt nothing in particular, which was the truest measure of how far she'd come. Then he picked up his hat and walked out. Hannah let out a breath she'd been holding for so long she couldn't remember when she'd started. The woman she'd been 2 months ago would have cried, she thought. The woman she'd been in Philadelphia would have cried from relief and from the strangeness of being in a room where people had spoken for her and the verdict had gone her way. She didn't cry. She felt tired and solid and clear, the way the air feels after a long storm. When it's finally still and the ground has taken in all the water it can hold and the sky looks like it means it. Cole came around the table and stood beside her and looked at the door Victor had gone through. "He'll file an appeal," Hannah said. "Probably," Cole said. "In a different court. Somewhere he thinks he has more leverage." "Maybe." He turned to look at her. "We'll deal with it if he does." She looked at him. All around them the room was still moving, still full of the aftersound of something significant, but in the small circle of their conversation, it was quiet. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. I know I said I'd stop thanking you, but this one I have to say." Cole looked at her with that expression she'd been accumulating, the one she'd stopped trying to fully decode and started simply receiving. "You did that yourself," he said. "Every bit of it." "You were there." "Yeah," he said. "I was." Pete appeared at Cole's shoulder wearing an expression of barely contained celebration. "Can we eat now?" he said. "I've been holding it together since 8 this morning, and I'm about at my limit. Despite everything, the week, the hearing, the hour of waiting, the weight of what had just happened." Hannah laughed. It came out of her without warning, real and slightly startled, and Cole looked at her when she did it with an expression that she would not classify for some time, but that she felt precisely and without confusion, in the center of her chest. "Yes, Pete," she said, "we can eat." They ate at Dora Finch's place because Dora had apparently anticipated the outcome with enough confidence to have started a pot of beef stew at noon and baked 2 pies by 2 in the afternoon, which either meant she had better faith in the legal system than most people, or she'd made the food anyway and was prepared to eat it alone if things went badly. Either way, there was food, and there was room at the long table in the back, and there were people who wanted to sit at it, and Hannah found herself in the middle of something that resembled a celebration without anyone having declared it one. Pete ate 2 bowls of stew and talked constantly. Ruiz ate 1 bowl and said almost nothing, which in the context of the day felt like its own kind of eloquence. Walt Briggs stopped in long enough to drink a cup of coffee and accept Dora's handshake and leave again, because Walt was the kind of man who felt discomfort at the center of celebrations, even ones that were partly his doing. Clara Ames came by and pressed Hannah's hand between both of hers and didn't say anything, which said enough. Aldridge appeared briefly, said something careful and diplomatic about being glad matters were resolved, and disappeared before anyone could ask him too many questions about his role in the preceding weeks. Cole sat beside Hannah and ate his stew and let Pete do the talking for once, which Pete required no encouragement to do. Hannah ate. She was genuinely hungry, which surprised her. She'd expected the adrenaline to have burned out her appetite entirely, but her body had apparently made its own assessment of the situation and decided they were through the worst of it, and it was time to eat. She ate half a bowl of stew and most of a piece of pie, and drank 2 cups of coffee and felt the afternoon settle around her like the cooling of a fire. She was not at ease. She would not have described herself as at ease. Victor Hale had walked out of that courtroom with his composure intact, which meant his capacity to cause trouble was intact, and she knew enough about him to understand that a denied petition was not the same as a surrendered campaign. But there was a layer of exhaustion underneath the alertness now that she recognized as the body's honest accounting of what the last 3 weeks had cost, and she let it exist without fighting it. On the ride home that evening, the sun was doing something extraordinary with the sky. All that flat Colorado Territory space turned into a canvas that didn't seem to understand the concept of restraint. Orange going into pink, going into a purple so deep it was almost painful to look at directly. Hannah watched it from the back of Patience, who had grown accustomed to the return journey from town and moved at a comfortable, self-directed pace. "You're quiet again," Cole said. "Still thinking. About Victor? About what comes next?" She watched the colors shift. "He won't appeal, not immediately. He'll go back east and wait and see if we stumble on our own. Men like Victor are patient. They don't escalate when there's no audience for it." "You think he'll come back?" "I think he'll watch," she said. "There's a difference." She glanced at Cole. "He's calculating whether I'm worth the continued effort. If the ranch does well, if we're solid, if there's nothing to exploit, eventually he moves on. Not because he's forgiven or forgotten, because there's nothing left to gain." Cole considered this. "And if there is something to exploit, then we don't give him anything." She turned her eyes back to the sky. "That's the work from now on. Not dramatic. Just don't stumble." "That's a lot of pressure to put on ordinary life." "Yes," she said. "It is." They rode the rest of the way in comfortable quiet, the horses finding their own rhythm on the familiar road, the sky going dark by degrees until the stars started, and the land went flat and black and enormous around them. July came in hot and immediate, the kind of heat that arrived with no apology and settled over the territory like a judgment. The cattle moved sluggishly. The creek level dropped 3 inches in 2 weeks. Hannah tracked the water table numbers against the previous year's records, which she'd found filed in the back of the older ledger, and told Cole they had a month before they'd need to think about relocating the herd to the north pasture where the spring-fed section would last longer. Cole looked at her numbers for a long moment and then said, "The north pasture fence needs work." "I know. Ruiz said last week. I put it in the maintenance log." "When did we start a maintenance log?" 6 weeks ago." She turned a page. "You signed off on it. You may not have read it." Cole looked at the ceiling briefly. "All right," he said. "North pasture fence this week." "I already told Ruiz," Hannah said. There was a pause. "You told Ruiz before you told me," Cole said. "Ruiz acts faster. I told you afterwards so you'd know what was happening." Cole looked at her with an expression that walked the line between exasperated and something warmer. "Is this how this is going to work?" "Probably," Hannah said. He made that sound, the almost laugh. "All right," he said. "Fine." This was roughly how most of their operational conversations went. Hannah had expected that coming into a working partnership with someone after the fact of marriage might be fraught. 2 people who'd agreed to share a life before they'd agreed on how to share a kitchen, which was honestly the harder negotiation. But Cole turned out to be a man who cared more about whether things worked than whether he was the one who'd decided how they'd work, which was either good management or good character, and she suspected it was both. They disagreed about things. That mattered. She'd lived in situations where disagreement was suppressed, and the artificial smoothness of those situations had always felt like a warning sign. Cole had opinions about how to handle the cattle in the heat that differed from what the numbers suggested to Hannah, and they had a conversation about it that was not entirely gentle, and eventually they split the difference and were both partly wrong and both partly right, and neither of them mentioned it again. She was wrong about the water table timeline by about a week and a half, which she noted in the records and corrected for future reference. Cole didn't say "I told you so," which she appreciated. She wouldn't have said it to him either. In August, a letter arrived from her father. She almost didn't open it right away. She set it on the table in the kitchen and went and did other things for an hour. Checked on a section of fence that Pete had flagged, worked through the month's accounts, helped Vera with a batch of preserves, and then came back and sat down with it. She wasn't sure what she was afraid of finding. Reproach, perhaps. Justification of the choices he'd made. The particular sadness of a person who's chosen the wrong thing and wants you to understand the circumstances that led to it. What she found was different from any of those. "Dear Hannah, I have received your letter and I have sat with it for some weeks before finding the words. I understand if this is too late. I imagine it may be. The hearing is over by now, and I hope the outcome was what you needed it to be. I should have written sooner, and I am not going to explain why I didn't, because you already understand it, and an explanation would only be more words in service of myself. I want to say this plainly. I was wrong. The arrangement I made with Victor Hale was wrong. What I asked you to endure was wrong. I've been telling myself for 2 years that it was the best option available to me, which was true in the most limited possible sense and false in every way that matters. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm asking only that you know I understand what I did. Your mother would have been ashamed of me, which I find that I can feel now in a way I couldn't bring myself to feel before. I hope you are well. I hope the man you married deserves you. Your father. Hannah read it twice. Then she folded it along its creases and held it on her lap. It was not a complete accounting. There were things in it she would have said differently, things he still didn't quite name, a softness at the edges where there should have been more precision. But it was more than she'd expected and more than she'd had from him in years, and she found that she could hold both of those things at once, the inadequacy and the sincerity, without needing to resolve them into a single clean emotion. She wrote him back that evening. It was a short letter. She told him about the ranch, about the water table situation, and the north pasture, and the way the summer heat came down here in a way she hadn't expected. She told him she was well. She told him the man she married was trying, which she meant as the highest compliment she knew how to give anyone. She didn't say she forgave him because she wasn't entirely sure she did, and she'd stopped saying things she wasn't sure of. But she sent the letter, which was its own kind of statement. Vera left in September. It was not a dramatic departure. Nothing with Vera ever was. She had a sister in New Mexico who had more need of her than the Brennan Ranch did, now that Hannah was there. And she made this assessment with the flat practicality that characterized everything she did, and began packing her things in the second week of September. Hannah helped her pack, because that was what you did. "You'll manage the kitchen," Vera said. It was not a question. "I'll manage," Hannah said. Vera folded a shawl with the precision of someone who had been folding shawls for 50 years and knew exactly how little effort was required. "The biscuit recipe is in the tin by the stove. Not the blue tin. The green one. I wrote it out last week." "I saw it. Thank you." Vera tucked the shawl into her trunk and looked at Hannah with the considering expression of a woman who'd been forming her final judgment for months and had come to a conclusion. "You're going to be all right," she said. Not warmly exactly, with the weight of someone who says things they mean. "I know," Hannah said. Vera looked at her for one more moment, then turned back to her packing. "Cole's going to need you to remind him to eat when he's busy with the books. He skips meals and then he's difficult." "I'll remember that." "And the east water trough needs checking every 3 days in summer, not every week. He forgets." "I'll check it." Vera closed the trunk. "Good," she said. Hannah drove her to town the next morning in the wagon. They talked about practical things the whole way, the preserves and the root cellar inventory and the supplier in the county seat who was reliable versus the one who wasn't. At the stage depot, Vera shook Hannah's hand with the firm grip of a woman who did not hug people. "Vera," Hannah said, "thank you for everything." Vera picked up her bag. "I knew from the second week you'd be fine," she said. "The chicken coop." "The chicken coop," Hannah said. "A woman who fixes a latch no one asked her to fix understands how a household works." Vera allowed herself the smallest possible expression of satisfaction. That's all. She boarded the stage and didn't look back, which was very much Vera, and Hannah stood in the depot and watched the coach pull away and felt the specific weight of the loss of someone who'd been acerbic and real, and never once made Hannah feel small for needing to learn things. In October, Emmett Grady's brother arrived. His name was Walter Grady, different Walter from the sheriff. And he was 56 years old, lean and sun-damaged from a life spent outdoors, with Emmett's same careful quality about him, but looser in the social manner, easier to talk to. He came to the ranch the day after he arrived in Red Mesa, because Walt Briggs had apparently told him about Hannah, and he'd wanted to meet her. They sat on the porch in the October afternoon, which was cool and clear in the particular way of Colorado autumn, the sky that specific shade of blue that seems more serious than summer blue. "He wrote about you," Walter Grady said. He held his coffee cup in both hands, the same way Hannah sometimes did. "Not a lot. Emmett wasn't a man who wrote a lot. But the last letter I got from him, maybe 2 months before he passed, he mentioned he'd been corresponding with a woman from Pennsylvania. Said she had sense. Hannah looked at her own cup. That was the highest thing in his letters, too, the things he valued. He'd have liked you, Walter said. It was simple and direct, the way people say things when they're sure of them. I don't say that to make you feel better. I mean it plainly. Thank you, Hannah said. I think I'd have liked him, too. Walter nodded. He looked out at the land. I'm going to sell the property, he said. I've got my own land in Missouri, and I'm too old to start over out here. But I wanted to see it first, see what he'd built. It's good land, Hannah said. The creek section especially. Whoever buys it, if you have a choice, make sure it goes to someone who'll use it properly and won't dam the creek. It feeds 3 properties downstream. Walter looked at her. You've thought about this. I've looked at the survey maps, she said. It's relevant to the water situation here. Walter smiled, the first full smile she'd seen from him, and it looked like Emmett might have looked if he'd smiled more. I'll keep it in mind, he said. He stayed in Red Mesa for 2 weeks, sorting through the legal arrangements with Aldridge. The property sold in November to a family named Casson, who were coming west from Missouri with 2 sons old enough to work, and the specific determination of people who've run out of options everywhere else and decided that counts as a reason to try something new. Hannah met them briefly before they arrived, because Walter had written to her asking if she'd be willing to give them some initial advice on the land, and she'd said yes. She spent an afternoon with the Cassons. The mother, a thin woman named Ruth with a dry manner and watchful eyes, and the father, Daniel, who asked sensible questions and wrote down the answers. She told them about the creek, about the north section and the fence, about the feed supplier she trusted and the one she didn't, about the way the weather moved through this particular valley. Ruth Casson, at the end of the afternoon, said, "We were told the woman at the Brennan Ranch was the person to ask." Hannah looked at her. "Who told you that?" Ruth thought about it. "Honestly, several people in town, the woman at the general store, the sheriff." Hannah absorbed this. "I'm glad it was useful," she said. On the ride home, she sat with that information and turned it over slowly. The woman at the Brennan Ranch. Not the large woman. Not the woman who came on the stagecoach. Not Cole Brennan's wife, in the tone that made the phrase a kind of footnote. Just the woman at the ranch. As if that said something specific and sufficient. As if it were its own designation. She didn't romanticize it. It was a small thing, a matter of how a few people had phrased a recommendation. But small things were the material that most of a life was made of, and she'd learned, or was learning, to pay attention to them. November brought cold and the particular satisfaction of being prepared for it. The root cellar was stocked. The hay supply was adequate. Hannah had pushed for an extra order in September, and Cole had agreed after consulting the numbers himself and arriving at the same conclusion. The cattle were in good condition, the north pasture fence had held through 3 hard rains, and the maintenance log that Cole had not initially realized he'd signed off on had caught 2 small problems before they became large ones. The ranch ran well. Not perfectly. Nothing ran perfectly. And Hannah had stopped expecting perfect sometime around her 2nd month here, when she'd understood that the frontier asked for good enough and got excellence when people refused to accept good enough as sufficient. The difference was not heroic. It was daily. It was showing up and paying attention and being honest about what the numbers said, even when what they said was inconvenient. One evening in late November, Cole came in from the barn later than usual. Hannah was at the kitchen table with the accounts, a lamp pulled close, her hand moving across the columns. She heard him at the door and didn't look up. She heard him stop. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway between the hall and the kitchen, still in his coat, looking at her with an expression she'd seen developing over the last few months the way weather develops. Gradually, and then all at once. It was the expression she'd been not naming, because naming it felt like getting ahead of something that needed to arrive in its own time. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. He came in and hung up his coat. "Long day." "There's soup, Vera's recipe, more or less." "More or less?" "I didn't have the dried thyme, so I used something else. It's fine." He poured himself a bowl and sat across from her and ate for a while. She went back to the accounts. The lamp between them made a small, warm circle that held the both of them without trying. "Hannah," he said. She looked up. He put down his spoon and looked at her with the directness he'd started allowing himself more often recently, the look that didn't hedge. I want to say something, and I'm going to say it plainly because I think you prefer that. I do, she said. This is a real marriage, he said. I know we started it for a reason, and I know we said we'd be honest if it became something else or didn't. I'm being honest. It's something else. He paused. For me, I don't know where you are. Hannah set down her pen. She thought about how to say what was true without overstating it, and without understating it either, which was a narrow target but the right one. She thought about what she'd felt in the courtroom when his hand had covered hers for a second, and then withdrawn. She thought about the mornings she'd stopped noticing were early, because she woke looking forward to the day rather than preparing to endure it. She thought about the specific ease of sitting in this kitchen at this hour, with the lamp between them and the soup on the stove and the accounts in front of her. I'm not good at this, she said. Neither am I. There was no one before Victor, and Victor was not. It wasn't. She stopped and started more carefully. I don't know what it's supposed to feel like. I don't have much to compare to. I don't need you to compare it to anything, Cole said. She looked at him. This man who had offered her a room when she had nothing and asked for nothing back, and then slowly, quietly, without making a production of it, had become the person she talked to when she was thinking through something hard. Who had stood beside her in a courtroom, not because he owed her something, but because he'd meant what he said when he said he would. I think I love you, she said. It came out more straightforwardly than she'd planned, which was probably the honest version. Cole looked at her. I'm not certain, she added. I'm working on being certain, but I think so. Something in his face settled into the expression she couldn't classify, the one that lived in the vicinity of relief and something warmer. That's enough, he said. Is it? Yeah, he said. It is. She looked at him for another moment, and then picked up her pen, because the accounts weren't finished and she was the kind of person who finished things. But something in the kitchen felt different. Not dramatic, not transformed, just settled in a new position, like a piece of furniture moved an inch to where it had always slightly better fit. The news about Victor Hale reached Red Mesa in January, carried by a businessman from Denver who'd passed through and had the story from someone who'd had it from someone in Philadelphia. Victor had died. A stroke in December. He'd been found at his desk in his study, which was either peaceful or ironic depending on your disposition, and had been buried quietly with a small family attendance. Walt Briggs told Hannah himself, in the sheriff's office on a Tuesday afternoon, with the careful neutrality of a man who didn't know quite what reaction to expect and was preparing himself for several possibilities. She sat with it for a moment. She tried to locate something in herself: grief, relief, satisfaction, guilt about satisfaction, and found something quieter than any of those. It was the feeling of a door closing on a room she'd already left. The room had been real. The damage had been real. But she'd been living somewhere else for months now, and the news of the door closing landed softly, without the weight she might have expected. Thank you for telling me, she said. Walt nodded. You all right? Yes, she said. And then because Walt had earned her honesty more than most people. I don't feel what I thought I'd feel. I thought there'd be more to it. People who spend a lot of energy being afraid sometimes find that when the thing that scared them is gone, there's mostly just quiet, Walt said. He said it without making it wise, just matter-of-factly, the way he said things he'd observed to be true. Yes, Hannah said. That's what it is. Quiet. She rode home and told Cole. He listened and nodded and said he was sorry, in the precise way you say you're sorry about the death of someone you hated, which is a strange and specific social act that mostly means, I'm sorry you have to have feelings about this at all. She appreciated the precision of it. That evening, she walked out to the corral and stood with patience in the cold January air and thought about 14 months of running and what had waited at the end of it. Not what she'd planned for, nothing like what she'd planned, but she'd learned, slowly and expensively, that planning was a way of telling yourself a story about the future and that the future had no particular obligation to cooperate. What you could control was smaller than you thought. What you could build from that smaller thing was larger than you expected. The ranch changed in the year that followed, and it changed because Hannah changed it. Not through any single dramatic decision, through the accumulated weight of small ones. She renegotiated their feed contract in the spring and saved enough to repair the barn roof before summer. She identified a market for early season beef in the county seat that no one had been supplying consistently, and they began supplying it. She worked with Pete to develop a culling system for the herd that improved their average weight by the following autumn. She kept the books with a precision that let Cole make decisions based on accurate information rather than estimates, which turned out to make a significant difference. People came to her for advice the way Ruth Casson had, and she gave it without pretension and without withholding. If she knew something useful, she said it. Clara Ames started directing new settlers to her for counsel on water rights and land management. Dora Finch began asking her to look over supply contracts before she signed them. Aldridge, after the initial awkwardness of having been on the wrong side of her situation, settled into a professional relationship with her that was mutually useful and occasionally almost warm. The town's opinion of her shifted in the way opinions shift when they're built on accumulated evidence rather than first impressions. Not all at once. Not uniformly. Margaret Holt's dressmaking shop remained a climate of pointed cordiality for considerably longer than Hannah would have liked, and there were always people who'd made up their minds early and found it difficult to update. But the majority, the broad ordinary center of a small community that was mostly made up of people who wanted practical things and responded to practical competence, came around to a view of Hannah Whitmore Brennan that was not what it had been when she stepped off a stagecoach with nowhere to go. They came to know her as someone who showed up, who answered questions straight, who could tell you what your feed costs should be and why yours were wrong and what to do about it, who had learned to ride on a gray mare named Patience and was still not graceful about it and had stopped caring. She was 30 years old when she understood, clearly and without needing to turn it over further, that she loved Cole. Not with the uncertainty of that kitchen conversation in November, with the settled knowledge of someone who'd watched a person in all the ordinary circumstances that reveal character, who'd disagreed with him and been disagreed with, who'd seen him lose his temper once over a broken wagon axle and then be embarrassed about it, who'd watched him with Pete in the particular way he had of teaching things without making people feel like they were being taught. She loved him the way you love something that's become necessary, not because it's perfect, but because it's real and it's yours. She told him this on a Sunday in March outside, because the day was warm enough to stand outside and she'd been thinking it long enough that it needed to be said. "I'm certain now," she said. "What I said in November. I'm certain." Cole looked at her with the expression she'd finally named sometime in February, which was simply, "You." Just that. The look of someone for whom you have become the specific person they were looking for without knowing what they were looking for. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." They stood there for a moment in the March air, the horses moving in the corral, the sound of Pete and Ruiz doing something involving a disagreement about a fence post in the distance. Ordinary life, in all its unremarkable persistence. "That's enough talking about it, I think," Hannah said. "Agreed," said Cole. There are things that don't resolve neatly. Hannah knew this and kept knowing it. Her father wrote a few more times, and she wrote back, and the correspondence was careful on both sides. The words of people navigating a relationship that had been damaged and couldn't be fully repaired, but could, perhaps, over time become something smaller and more honest than what it had been. She didn't know if they'd ever see each other again. She held that uncertainty without trying to close it. She thought sometimes about Emmett Grady, about the 12 letters in their soft folds and the careful penmanship, and the man she'd traveled 1,000 miles to meet and never met. She thought the story of that could have broken her, the waste of it, the tragedy of arriving too late. And instead it had brought her here, which was not what she'd planned, and was more than she'd hoped for. She was not sentimental enough to call it fate. She was honest enough to call it luck, which is the real name for the unpredictable collision of circumstances and character that occasionally lands you somewhere better than you expected. She'd arrived with nothing and built something real. Not because the world had been generous to her, but the world had not particularly. Not because she'd been extraordinary. She was ordinary in most of the ways that counted, which meant she got tired and made mistakes and was sometimes wrong and had to recalibrate. But she had refused, at every point where it seemed easier to stop. She had kept her hands on the work and her eyes on what was true, and she had moved forward in the way that scared her least, which was one day at a time with a clear accounting of what she had. That was not a lesson she could have told you in advance. It was the kind of thing you learn from the inside of it, from years of getting up early and doing the next thing and discovering that the next thing, accumulated, is a life. People in Red Mesa would tell the story differently depending on who was telling it. Some of them told it as a love story, which was true but incomplete. Some told it as a legal story, which was also true and also incomplete. Some told it as a story about Victor Hale and his defeat, which missed the point considerably. The closest version was the one Dora Finch told, years later, to a young woman who'd arrived in Red Mesa alone on a freight wagon with a trunk and nowhere particular to go. Dora pointed across the street to where Hannah was coming out of Aldridge's office, with a folder of papers under her arm and a purposeful stride. "That woman," Dora said, "came here with nothing. And she didn't wait for anyone to give her something. She just kept working until what she'd built was worth having." The young woman looked at Hannah Whitmore Brennan, who was 33 years old and knew the water table of 3 adjacent properties and the feed costs of every ranching operation within 20 miles, and the name of every horse she'd ever ridden, including the gray mare, whose patience had outlasted her own stubbornness. "Did it work?" the young woman asked. Dora looked at her. "Look at her," she said. "What do you think?" Hannah crossed the street without looking back, because there was work to do and the afternoon was running short, and Patience was tied at the post outside the general store waiting to go home, and home was worth getting back to.